The first whispers drifted through London the way ether once had, soft, sweet, and a little dangerous. Behind frosted chemist windows, clerks lowered their voices as elegant women asked for the new miracle, a vial that promised to hush hunger itself. Parlours buzzed, street lamps glowed through December fog, and already the city felt that familiar tremor it had known a century before, when another chemical arrived with the same promise of instant transformation and left bones, fortunes, and reputations in ruins. They said this new drug was modern, scientific, respectable, but so, too, had the Victorians believed in their slimming tonics, ether tinctures that tightened waists, cocaine cordials that brightened the eyes, opium drafts that delivered sleep without dreams. London adored a shortcut then. It adores one now. Tonight there is an unease beneath the glamour, quiet panic tucked behind jeweled brooches, physicians arguing behind mahogany doors. Society. Women waiting for results that promise a smaller waist but come wrapped in warnings whispered like confessions. Once again, the city stands at the edge of a chemical miracle or a chemical mistake. Subscribe and stay with me. More fog-lit truths wait in the corners where beauty, danger, and desperation walk arm in arm. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The first hint of the craze did not come from newspapers or fashionable salons, but from the soft scratch of a clerk's pen behind a chemist's counter on a dim London afternoon. Outside, the fog had settled low, moving like a slow creature along the pavement, muffling carriage wheels and swallowing whole the shapes of hurried passers-by. Inside, however, the world was still too still, lit only by the amber glow of a single gas lamp hanging above rows of glass vials. Their labels, tidy and pale, looked almost self-conscious as they stared out from the shelves, as if they knew that something new, something powerful, had just joined their company. The chemist himself said nothing. He merely adjusted his spectacles and slid the discreet brown package across the counter, its edges wrapped so neatly that no one would guess what it contained unless they, too, were part of this quiet, growing circle. The woman receiving it was dressed in a manner that did not suggest desperation: ermine collar, polished boots, the faintest scent of rosewater trailing behind her, but her hands trembled when they closed around the parcel. She did not ask for instructions, she already knew them. And as she left, the clerk watched the fog swallow her whole and wondered, not for the first time, how long London would remain calm before the whispers turned into a frenzy. Those whispers drifted swiftly. They seeped through the corridors of Belgravia townhouses, where ladies rehearsed their polite refusals at dinner parties. They curled through the drawing rooms of Mayfair, settling beside silver mirrors and lace-trimmed gloves. "It works," someone murmured behind a fan at a charity ball. "No hunger at all, not even at supper." A statement delivered softly, like a confession, but with enough brightness in the eyes to reveal that this was no ordinary remedy. It was a promised slimness without suffering, ease without effort, the sort of promise that London, in every century, found irresistible. The city had been here before. Long before syringes and modern science, London had filled its lungs with ether vapors in the name of calmness and clarity. Women dabbed coca wine behind their ears, believing it sharpened their wit. Opium dissolved into teacups, sweetened with honey, was poured as casually as afternoon Earl Grey. In those days, too, a miracle was always just one swallow away, and even then, people told themselves the same thing the new devotees muttered now, that they were in control, that they would not become like the unfortunate souls who leaned too heavily on a bottle or a vial, that everything, absolutely everything, would remain respectable. But London is a city that listens before it understands, and in that early stage, as the whispers slid down its streets, the danger was still wrapped neatly in paper and tied with twine. The chemists were careful, the physicians were confident. The demand, though quiet, grew with the steady pressure of rising tidewater. You could see it in the way women glanced at one another during fittings, measuring their own waists against the ghost of another's silhouette. You could hear it in the tones of polite conversation, as if the entire city had begun to breathe shallowly, holding itself in. In that gaslit world of reflections and restraint, the first wave of Londoners stepped into the modern craze with the same trembling eagerness their Victorian ancestors had shown toward ether and cocaine tonics. It felt new, it felt scientific. It felt safe because danger rarely arrives wearing its own name. It arrives instead as a whisper beneath the chemist's lamp, faint enough to be ignored, sweet enough to be believed, and strong enough to shape a city before it even notices the change. And so the craze began not with panic, but with longing, not with chaos, but with quietness. London's appetite for miracles had returned, and the city, wrapped in fog, welcomed it without question. Morning light in London is never truly bright. It seeps rather than shines, sliding through curtains like a timid visitor, illuminating rooms in tones of pearl grey and pale gold. In one such room, high-ceilinged, papered in soft blue damask, with a silver-backed brush resting primly on a vanity, stood a woman contemplating her reflection with the same quiet dread that had haunted Victorian dressing rooms a century before. Yet this was not the dread of corset laces pulled too tight or waists measured in inches. This was something sleeker, more modern, but no less demanding. On the vanity lay a small velvet pouch, its drawstrings loosened. Inside, nestled with almost ceremonial importance, was a slender syringe filled with the faintest whisper of clear liquid. No ornate bottle, no swirling ether vapor, no bitter tonic disguised by rosewater, only a simple medical instrument, cold, efficient, and utterly transformative. She looked at it the way her great-grandmother might have looked at a vial of patent slimming cordial, with hope first, fear second. But hope always spoke louder. That was the trouble with London. Its faith in remedies had remained unshaken across the centuries. The city might trade crinolines for cropped trousers and hansom cabs for electric cars, but its yearning to sculpt the body into something finer, sharper, more admired had never softened. Her fingers hovered above the syringe. Outside, a milkman shouted his route. A bus hissed against the curb. The morning paper thumped against the door. The world was moving. No one would pause to ask if she had eaten breakfast or whether she felt faint. Everyone was too busy shrinking themselves or discussing those who had. Society, it seemed, had reunited around an old obsession wearing a new face. She took a slow breath, steadying her hand. The silver mirror reflected not just her figure, but every comparison she'd made in the past week. Women gliding through cafes with narrow torsos, actresses posing on screens with bodies like polished marble, friends whose cheekbones had grown mysteriously sharper since the season began. Politeness kept the questions silent, but the answers hung in the air, like the scent of perfume just departed. They were all dosing. Wordlessly, she rolled up the sleeve of her peignoir. The skin of her arm looked paler than usual in the half-light, almost translucent, as though even it anticipated the coming transformation. How easy it seemed, one measured press of the plunger, one simple ritual repeated weekly, and hunger would fall away like a forgotten habit. No diets, no fainting spells, none of the old Victorian languor brought on by cinched waists and skipped luncheons. This was modern restraint, invisible, clinical, dignified. Yet dignity is a delicate thing. It rests precariously between choice and compulsion, and London had always blurred that line. Once, ladies claimed that laudanum soothed their nerves. In truth, it soothed their sorrows and their waistlines. Now women claimed the injection was for wellness, for balance, for metabolic health, but the mirror, relentless, unforgiving, knew better. The syringe touched her skin. A moment of hesitation, barely a breath's length, then the subtle sting as the liquid entered her bloodstream. She exhaled slowly, as though releasing not just air but uncertainty itself. The pouch was closed, the syringe placed back inside with ceremonial neatness. By the time she lowered her sleeve, she felt calmer, buoyed not by the drug's chemistry, but by the promise it carried. In the silence that followed, she gazed once more into the mirror. Her face had not changed, her body had not shifted, but something beneath the surface, intangible and electric. A decision had been made, and decisions, once made in London, had a way of echoing far beyond the rooms in which they were formed. Outside, the fog was thinning. Inside, she straightened her posture, smoothed her hair, and prepared to meet the world with the quiet determination of someone who had chosen her remedy and believed wholeheartedly that it would choose her back. London's new ritual had begun, one reflective morning at a time. Breakfast, once the modest anchor of a London morning, had begun to lose its footing. Where the clatter of cutlery once mingled with the hiss of the kettle and the rustle of newspapers, now silence reigned, thin, chilly, almost brittle. Plates were set out as always, toast browned to polite perfection, eggs resting beneath a tent of rising steam, but no hands reached for them. Appetite, that old companion of domestic ritual, had become an inconvenience. And in houses across the city, from Kensington apartments dressed in velvet to terraced homes lined with ivy meals, were becoming performances meant for appearance rather than consumption. It started subtly. A woman might poke at her porridge while claiming she'd eaten earlier. A gentleman might fold his napkin with practiced ease and remark that he wasn't quite feeling himself. Children overheard, growing accustomed to the idea that skipping a meal was a gesture of willpower rather than a sign of need. Servants cleared untouched dishes with downcast eyes, wondering whether to express concern or stay silent, remembering stories told by their own mothers, stories of Victorian households where ladies fainted from hunger but called it fashion. Once again, London was returning to that peculiar ritual, the art of refusing food gracefully. In drawing rooms, ladies sat with teacups balanced on gloved fingertips, insisting they simply were not hungry, while exchanging the faintest smiles, knowing and wanting others to know that their secret lay not in discipline but in a vial tucked neatly into their vanity drawers. The injections dulled more than appetite. They softened anxieties, dampened cravings, wrapped the mind in a quiet fog that made the absence of meals feel not alarming but efficient. The city's cafes noticed the shift before anyone else. Baristas watched pastries cool untouched behind glass. Servers collected untouched plates with the mechanical sorrow of museum attendants, dusting artifacts no one wished to examine. Lunchtime reservations held their numbers, but food consumption sank deeper than the Thames in winter. People arrived for meetings only to stir soups without sipping them, nodding through business proposals while the scent of broth evaporated into nothing. And yet, no one complained. Hunger was a thing from which the city believed itself liberated. Newspapers praised modern metabolic mastery, placing glossy photos of suddenly slim celebrities beside advertisements for wellness clinics. Influencers uploaded images of untouched charcuterie boards beneath captions, praising the beauty of restraint. Everyone applauded the ease of it, the elegance. Even physicians praised the results, at least publicly, though more than a few privately admitted discomfort as their waiting rooms filled with pale faces and hollowed cheeks reminiscent of a century-old portrait. Meanwhile, kitchens grew quieter. Housewives once prided on hearty suppers, now prepared meals for partners who claimed they'd dined earlier. Grandmothers fretted that their daughters-in-law no longer asked for recipes. Young women scrolled through health forums late at night, comparing injection sites the way their Victorian predecessors once compared corset bruises. But the most striking silence of all happened at the dining tables themselves. Conversations remained lively. Londoners never lost their appetite for gossip, but forks remained idle, knives untouched. Toast cooled to paper, tea turned tepid. The butter dish remained pristine, its surface unmarred by so much as a scrape. In these rooms, the absence of appetite felt almost holy, as though women and increasingly men believed they were participating in a ritual of ascension, rising above the bodily needs that had tethered generations before them. But ascension can look alarmingly similar to decline, and the line between them had begun to blur under the soft haze of London's winter fog. Day by day, meal by untouched meal, the city was slipping into an old habit dressed in new science. Plates remained set, kitchens stayed warm, and food continued to be prepared with the same care as always. Yet the ritual, the true ritual, the acceptance of nourishment was evaporating, ghost-like, before it ever reached the table. And somewhere in that stillness, in that quiet refusal repeated house by house, London's hunger began to shift from physical to something far more dangerous, a hunger for perfection, sharpened by modern chemistry, wrapped in Victorian longing, and fed not by food, but by absence. The doctors had begun to speak with the sure-footed confidence of men who believed they were standing at the dawn of a new medical age. Their voices, steady, polished, deliberate, floated through consulting rooms lined with mahogany cabinets and framed diplomas, creating an atmosphere of authority so reassuring that few dared question it. In the soft glow of shaded lamps, where dust motes drifted lazily like drifting ghosts of older medicines, London's physicians wrote prescriptions as though signing elegant invitations to a slimmer, easier life. In truth, medicine had always carried a certain theatrical quality within the city. The Victorian era had offered its own stagecraft. Ether demonstrations performed with the flourish of magicians, laudanum prescribed with silk-gloved precision, cocaine tonics described as invigorating elixirs. Doctors then, too, had believed wholeheartedly in their tools. They whispered promises to patients behind closed doors, assuring them their nerves would be soothed, their appetites quieted, their spirits lifted, and their patients, yearning for relief, believed them. Now, a century later, the same dynamic quietly resurfaced. The modern physician no longer reached for crystal bottles with ornate labels. Instead, he tapped against the cool metal of a filing cabinet, consulted charts projected in glimmering light, or scrolled through tablets whose white brightness cast ghostly reflections on his spectacles. Yet the confidence remained unmistakably Victorian, polished, unwavering, and tinged with the faintest note of pride. "Perfectly safe," one doctor murmured in Chelsea, sliding a pamphlet across his desk. "A breakthrough," another declared in Marylebone, tapping the diagram of a shrinking stomach with the pride of a man unveiling a new invention. "A modern miracle," insisted a third in Notting Hill, leaning back as though awaiting applause. Patients nodded, comforted by the tone if not the details. They trusted the certainty. They trusted the crisp white coats, the brass nameplates, the immaculate waiting rooms, scented faintly of eucalyptus and antiseptic. Most of all, they trusted the idea that science, sharp, clean, progressive, had finally solved a problem that Victorian society had battled with corsets, tonics, and whispered desperation. But confidence is a delicate performance, and beneath the polished surface, cracks had begun to form. A few physicians, older ones, usually lingered by their office windows after appointments, gazing out onto fog-wrapped streets with brows furrowed in uneasy recollection. They remembered lectures on historical follies, radium water, once praised as vitality incarnate, morphine given freely to calm infants' coughs, arsenic wafers sold as beautifying agents. They remembered, too, how quickly enthusiasm could turn to regret. For every miracle cure London had embraced, there had been a hidden cost, buried at first beneath flattery and optimism. Yet the new generation of doctors dismissed such worries with a wave of the hand. Different times, they insisted. Different science, different safeguards. And perhaps they were right, perhaps nothing truly dangerous lay coiled within those syringes. But confidence, once shared too freely, has a way of becoming contagious, and soon even the most cautious physicians found themselves swept into the city's rising tide of assurance. After all, their colleagues endorsed it, their patients demanded it, their phones rang with inquiries before breakfast, and their schedules filled with consultations that doubled by the week. By late autumn, clinics across London stood as modern equivalents of Victorian apothecaries. Lines stretched into lobbies, where women in tailored coats whispered anxiously while men pretended not to listen. A receptionist might close the door gently behind each patient, but the hum of excitement and fear bled through walls and hallways, settling in the air like perfume. Doctors, too, felt the pressure. The city expected them not merely to heal, but to sculpt, to refine, to offer chemical solutions to problems born of vanity, social compression, and the relentless march of comparison. And as expectations swelled, so did their resolve to deliver results, even if it meant ignoring a tug of doubt that occasionally tightened behind the ribs. In those quiet moments when night had settled and the lamps hummed low, some physicians wondered whether they had stepped, knowingly or not, into the same shadowed territory their Victorian predecessors once occupied, that uncertain space where medicine, ambition, and society's hunger for transformation all blurred together. But morning always returned. The fog lifted, the phones rang, and the confidence polished, practiced, and necessary returned with it. London asked for certainty, and the doctors gave it, even if, deep down, they sensed the city was asking for far more than medicine alone could offer. Society has an uncanny habit of resurrecting its old hierarchies, polishing them just enough to convince itself they are new. By the time the injections had fully threaded themselves through London's social circuits, slimness, once the prized silhouette of Victorian drawing rooms, had returned as a marker of quiet superiority. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with that soft, insidious elegance that London prefers when enforcing its invisible rules. At luncheons in Belgravia, where delicate porcelain plates were placed upon starched linens, women arrived in gowns that draped more loosely than in seasons past, not because the fashion demanded it, but because their bodies had begun to narrow, sharpen, refine. Shoulders appeared more angular, wrists more delicate, cheekbones more pronounced beneath the rose silk glow of chandelier light. Compliments fluttered through the air like moths, never explicit, praise for weight loss, of course, but coded remarks wrapped in gentility. "You look positively radiant," one woman murmured, her eyes flicking just briefly to the smaller waistline of her companion. "Your dress hangs beautifully," another said, the tone warm, but the meaning unmistakable. "You must share your secret," whispered a third, though both knew exactly what the secret was. The magic of the new craze lay not merely in its effect, but in its discretion. In the Victorian era, a woman's pursuit of thinness had been a visible labour corsets, laced until ribs trembled, meals skipped until fainting spells became fashionable, laudanum sipped to quiet the gnawing ache of hunger. Now, the labour had vanished into the sleek quietness of a weekly dose. No struggle, no sacrifice, only results. And results, in London, always travel faster than caution. In gentlemen's clubs draped in burgundy velvet, men commented subtly, of course, on the changing silhouettes of their wives and acquaintances. They framed their observations in the language of health, athleticism, vitality. It was easier that way, more respectable, but beneath the polished words lay the same truth Victorian men once admired, a slenderness that signaled control, restraint, and social distinction. Even among the young, the hierarchy took shape with ruthless efficiency. University students sipped black coffee in dim cafes, their laptops open, their plates untouched, their eyes scanning the sharp lines of one another's jawbones as though assessing an unspoken competition. Social media only intensified it, photographs filtered in soft gold, bodies angled to emphasize the newly narrowed waist, captions that read nothing of injections, yet carried echoes of Victorian vanity. The city had not changed. It had only updated its vocabulary. Slimness became an emblem not merely of beauty, but of discipline, intellect, and lifestyle. One was not just thinner, one was modern, informed, health-focused, optimized. The language formed a protective sheath, disguising the old aspiration beneath a new rationality. Yet, in quieter corners of London, laundromats in Brixton, shared flats in Shoreditch, bus stops in Hackney, the status lines flickered uncomfortably. Not everyone could afford these new miracles. Not everyone had access to the weekly appointments, the private clinics, the soft-spoken assurances. And so the divide widened, not with the clang of inequality, but with the gentle rustle of fabric falling loosely around privileged frames. The Victorian era had known this divide well. Wealthy women could afford patent medicines and imported tonics. The poor had only bone-thin hunger. Now, the pattern returned. Slimness as luxury, slimness as performance, slimness as social capital. As the city moved through winter, hosting soirees lit by golden lamps and gatherings perfumed with jasmine and bergamot, the hierarchy deepened. In every room, eyes wandered subtly, always subtly taking silent inventory. Who had shrunk, who had not, who looked sharpened, ethereal, almost unreal under the glow of candlelight. Thinness, once again, had become a currency. And in London, where currencies of appearance have always been traded with exquisite delicacy, that currency was growing more valuable by the day. Dusk in London possesses a peculiar sort of intimacy. The lamplighters move through the streets like silent ushers, coaxing small golden flames to life, while the fog thickens in gentle folds around the city's stone shoulders. It is at this hour, neither day nor night, that the pharmacies transform from ordinary establishments into the quiet nerve centres of London's newest obsession. Their windows glow softly, like lanterns beckoning ships in from a restless sea. Behind each pane, shelves lined with bottles and vials glimmer faintly under amber lamps. Victorian apothecaries once held much the same charm. Narrow aisles smelling of camphor and lavender, drawers of powdered roots, jars of mysterious tinctures promising serenity or slenderness in equal measure. Now, the aesthetics have modernized chrome instead of brass, glass instead of crystal, but the atmosphere remains hauntingly familiar. By late afternoon, a queue begins to form outside nearly every pharmacy in the wealthier districts. It is not a noisy line. London queues are never noisy. Instead, people stand with a certain strained composure, their breath frosting faintly in the cooling air, their eyes fixed on the warm interior beyond the door. They hold handbags close, occasionally glancing at their reflections in the window, quick, assessing, hopeful. The door opens intermittently, releasing a breath of sterile air tinged with eucalyptus. A pharmacist steps forward, his white coat immaculate, his face politely neutral. He calls names with the same solemnity Victorian chemists once used when presenting laudanum to trembling hands. And though the modern packages are discreet and unassuming small boxes, sealed envelopes, the customers treat them as though receiving a sacred object. Inside, the scene shifts into something that feels almost ceremonial. Pharmacists, once the guardians of opiates and ether, now navigate computer systems with gloved fingers, verifying doses, confirming patient files. Their voices remain soft, tinged with a kind of rehearsed reassurance. Some speak with brisk confidence. No contraindications. You're clear to continue. Others lean forward, lowering their tone. Any nausea? Any dizziness? Do ring us if anything feels amiss. Patients nod quickly, too eager to appear troubled. They sign forms with hurried strokes, their hands betraying a mixture of dependence and anticipation. Then they exit with their parcels tucked close to the body, stepping into the cold, lamplit fog as though clutching talismans against the chaos of appetite. It is in these moments, watching the steady flow of figures slipping in and out, that one might notice how similar the pattern is to that of London more than a century ago. Back then, just after sunset, women drifted quietly into apothecaries for nervousness tonics, the euphemism for opiate-laced elixirs. They moved with the same air of secrecy, the same hunger for control disguised as medical necessity. History, it seems, walks in circles through the city's fog. As the evening deepens, the queues thin but never disappear entirely. Some customers arrive late, wrapped in wool coats, their faces paler than in weeks past. The pharmacist recognizes them, of course he does, and greets them with familiar gravity. These late arrivals are often the most desperate. Those who felt the day's hunger returning sharper than expected, those worried their next dose might be delayed, those still clinging to the illusion of effortless transformation. Inside, a bell above the door chimes softly each time someone enters. The sound is delicate, almost mournful, echoing faintly around shelves stacked with promise. And at the back of the shop, beneath a clock that ticks too loudly in the stillness, a row of small refrigeration units hums steadily, cold machines holding vials of ambition, fear, vanity, and hope. By the time night fully settles, the lamps burn lower, their glow turning syrupy and warm. The pharmacists wipe their counters, lock their cabinets, and sweep away the faint traces of another day's transactions. Outside, the final customers disappear into the fog, their silhouettes swallowed by the city's darkened streets. And as the shop doors close with a soft, almost tender click, London feels as though it has exhaled, not in relief, but in something far closer to resignation. For dusk has revealed what daylight tries to deny, that the city's appetite may be fading, but its hunger for control, for beauty, for miracles burns brighter than ever. Beneath those softly glowing pharmacy lamps, there is a peculiar seduction in the idea of control without effort, an illusion so intoxicating that London, in every century, has surrendered to it without hesitation. By the height of the new craze, the city had convinced itself that willpower could be outsourced, that hunger could be muted with the elegance of turning down a gas lamp, and that the ancient struggle between desire and restraint could finally be resolved, not through discipline, but through chemistry. Control, after all, had always been the most fashionable accessory in London society. Victorian women wore it beneath their corsets, their breaths shallow but their posture perfect. Men carried it in pocket watches, their time regimented to the minute. Even the city itself seemed built upon the idea, its orderly squares, its iron railings, its pavements swept clean by dawn. The pursuit of self-mastery had always thrummed beneath London's orderly exterior, like a second heartbeat. Now that same heartbeat pulsed through the city's new ritual. People spoke of the injections with a kind of reverent simplicity. "It makes everything easier," they whispered at brunches where no one ate. "You simply don't think about food." The words were offered with the soft awe of a miracle recounted in a candle-lit chapel. They made the hardest part of human existence, managing want, feel almost optional. No cravings tugged at the mind, no meals tempted the senses. It was as though appetite had been gently escorted out of one's life by an invisible hand wearing white gloves. In Chelsea townhouses, women found themselves gliding through days with an unfamiliar sense of lightness. They moved from task to task without the tug of bodily desire interrupting their rhythm. Their schedules, once shaped by breakfasts and lunches and small indulgences, grew streamlined, elegant, ethereal. Time, it seemed, had been freed as well, no longer punctuated by cravings, no longer carved into portions by meals. Men, too, succumbed to the allure. Businessmen who once relied on hearty lunches to break the monotony of negotiations now found themselves surprised by uninterrupted focus. They boasted, privately but proudly, that their minds felt sharpened, their bodies efficient, their discipline nearly absolute. "I've gained clarity," one murmured in a club so dimly lit that his face appeared almost sculpted in shadow. Pure clarity, as though the noise of the body has been silenced. But silence, when too complete, becomes its own kind of unease. Friends began to notice the subtle shifts. Not the shrinking waistlines they celebrated those, but the quietness behind the eyes, the faint slackening of pleasure when plates were set out at dinner, the hesitation before sipping even a cup of tea. A sense of detachment settled over some, like a thin veil drawn gently between them and the world. Food had once stitched people together at tables, in cafes, during celebrations. Now, those stitches loosened, and conversations drifted without the warmth that shared meals once offered. In the privacy of their homes, a few began to wonder whether control had become not freedom but confinement. A woman in Hampstead stared at the untouched fruit bowl on her counter and felt a strange ache, not hunger, but something like memory. A man in Camden, once delighted by the bakery on his street corner, found himself walking past it without noticing the scent of fresh bread. There were moments when the absence of want felt less like mastery and more like erasure, but such doubts were fleeting, drowned beneath the louder chorus of admiration from friends and colleagues. Compliments arrived daily, subtle, flattering, addictive in their own way. Control, visible and admired, was hard to question when society applauded it with such enthusiasm. The promise remained irresistible: to be untouched by temptation, to live above the demands of the body, to exist in a state of permanent refinement. It was the modern echo of the Victorian dream, to appear serene, immaculate, unburdened by earthly needs. Effortless control was the grand illusion London had purchased once before, wrapped in bottles of ether and powders of coca leaf, and now it had returned in a needle's whisper, offering the same seduction, that one could escape being human, without anyone noticing the cost. By the time winter settled its pale hand over London, the market surrounding the new injections had swollen into something both lucrative and faintly unsettling, a latticework of desire, supply, and carefully polished illusion. As with every beauty craze before it, the city's appetite for transformation had opened 1,000 doors for commerce, each more refined, more discreet, more extravagantly packaged than the last. Vanity, that old Victorian ghost, had returned to guide the invisible hand of the marketplace. Pharmacies, once modest establishments warmed by the murmur of customers seeking cough syrup and liniment, were the first to adapt. Their front windows glimmered more brightly at dusk, their displays more artfully arranged, their staff trained in the delicate choreography of discretion. Behind the counter, the packages grew sleeker, labels became minimalist and expensive-looking. The printing on the leaflets shifted from clinical to aspirational. Even the act of receiving a prescription began to resemble a small ceremony, a subtle nod to the consumer's elevated taste. But it was not only chemists who felt the surge. Private clinics emerged in converted townhouses, their brass plaques newly engraved, their interiors swathed in soft neutrals and velvet chairs. Clients were greeted with peppermint-scented towels, offered herbal teas they would not drink, and handed informational booklets printed on heavy, matte paper. These spaces became sanctuaries for the city's upper circles, places where beauty was treated not as frivolity but as refinement, where the pursuit of thinness was framed as wellness, longevity, self-improvement, and London embraced it all with enthusiastic grace. Advertisements, never vulgar, always understated, found their way into lifestyle magazines, nestled between articles about Italian holidays and eco-friendly couture. They whispered of metabolic elegance, modern control, and restored balance. No mention of dieting, no suggestion of struggle. The language itself had been curated into something airy and immaculate, much like the customers it sought to entice. Within weeks, boutique wellness brands began to orbit the craze like moths around a flame. They introduced refrigerated carrying cases lined with satin, travel-friendly dose reminder journals, and pastel-toned support supplements that promised to complement the effects of the injections. None of these were necessary, of course, but London had never resisted the allure of accessorizing its obsessions. In drawing rooms from Mayfair to Westminster, these small luxuries sat beside cosmetic brushes and perfume atomizers, each item proof not of need, but of belonging. Yet the market did not stop at elegance. Something darker, quieter was beginning to thicken beneath its surface. Counterfeit kits appeared on obscure websites. Clinics without credentials sprouted in alleys off the high streets. Desperate messages circulated in private forums, written by people who feared their supply would falter and were willing to purchase whatever they could find. It echoed the Victorian black market for opium tinctures and slimming powders, whispered about behind lace curtains. London has always been a city skilled at dressing its vices in velvet. For every polished clinic, there was a hidden room where the transaction was less refined, more hurried, more dangerous. For every wealthy customer who booked follow-up appointments with attentive staff, there was someone else who clicked "Buy Now" on a suspicious listing and hoped the parcel would not bring harm. Still, the overall veneer remained beautiful. That was the genius of the market. It carved itself around vanity so seamlessly that even its darkest corners appeared softened by the city's fog, its risks shrouded in the language of hope. By February, the injections had become not just a treatment, but a symbol of status, of self-mastery, of participation in an elite world where bodies were sculpted with precision and appetite subdued with elegance. And London, ever eager to keep pace with its own reflection, invested in this symbol with an almost feverish devotion. The market had grown vast and intricate, profitable, polished, and quietly perilous. And, at its centre, pulsed the same old truth that Victorian London knew all too well. Where vanity blooms, commerce follows. And where commerce thrives, caution often fades into the fog. London, with all its restless ambition and fog-soft memories, has always been a city that forgets selectively. It remembers the grandeur of its eras, the carriages clattering along Pall Mall, the velvet-draped parlours of Mayfair, the first glow of electric lamps along the Strand, but it forgets the darker threads woven through its own history. And so, when the new injections swept through the city like a fashionable storm, few paused to recognize their lineage. For though clothed in modern science and delivered through chilled vials, these drugs were, in spirit, the direct descendants of the Victorian tinctures that once promised women the same elegant transformation. The tincture's granddaughter, some observers called it quietly. Not in public, not in print, but in the whispered, slightly uneasy conversations shared by those old enough to remember the tail end of London's laudanum shadows. For the resemblance, once seen, could never be unseen. In Victorian times, the slimming tonics had been both celebrated and discreet. They arrived in bottles etched with delicate script, filled with mixtures of opium, coca leaf extract, and alcohol disguised beneath floral essences. Advertisements promised a refined lightness of form, relief from the burden of appetite, and the restoration of feminine delicacy. Women consumed them with the same hopeful determination that their descendants now brought to the weekly injection. A few drops under the tongue, a sip before supper, a swallow in moments of nervousness. Now, the method had changed, but the promise had not. In modern clinics, nurses prepared syringes with hands steadied by training and habit. The drug inside was clear, almost innocent-looking, without the amber tint of Victorian tonics. It was measured precisely, delivered swiftly, and accompanied by pamphlets filled with diagrams and medical reassurance. The presentation was scientific, sterile, refined. Yet beneath this polished surface pulsed a familiar melody. Hush your hunger, quiet your wants, become lighter, easier, lovelier, a message the city had heard before. Late-night buses rumbled down streets where Victorian apothecaries once stood, their original brass bells long removed, but their ghosts lingering faintly in the brickwork. And if one stood near those corners during the quiet hours when the fog thickened and the street lamps hummed, you might almost imagine the scent of old tinctures mixing with the faint antiseptic smell drifting from modern clinics. The past and present brushing fingers like relatives who pretend not to know each other. Even the language surrounding the new drug bore echoes of its predecessor. Victorian women spoke of refinement, decline of appetite, and becoming more graceful. Now, the words had been updated to wellness, metabolic reset, and long-term optimization. Different vocabulary, identical yearning. Human vanity, after all, does not age out of its desires. It merely dresses them in contemporary clothing. Scholars and historians noticed the parallels more quickly than most. Articles began to circulate, quiet pieces tucked into academic journals or the opinion pages of cultural reviews warning that London was again walking the thin line between enhancement and illusion. One historian wrote, "We are witnessing the resurrection of the old tincture, but rebuilt with stainless steel and scientific language." Another noted, "The Victorian hunger to transcend the body has reawakened." Still, the public paid little attention. The allure of effortless change was stronger than caution, the glow of transformation brighter than any historical shadow. People wanted the promise, not the warning. And the family resemblance between old tincture and new injection remained politely unspoken, like an inconvenient truth that London, with its polished manners, preferred not to acknowledge. Yet, beneath the city's elegance, beneath the fog and the street lamps, and the clinking of crystal glasses at winter soirees, the lineage endured. The new craze walked in the footsteps of its ancestor, guided by the same hunger, the same longing, the same quiet desperation dressed as refinement. London had once transformed itself with drops from a bottle. Now it did so with the whisper of a needle. Different era, different method, same inheritance. The tincture had never truly disappeared. It had merely grown up. London, for all its brilliance and civility, has never been a city particularly skilled at moderation. It rushes toward every new marvel as though chasing a departing carriage, breathless and eager, convinced that this innovation, this substance, this technology, this promise will finally perfect the human condition. And when the city believes in something, it does so with a fervor that borders on reverence. No half measures, no gentle explorations. London commits. Thus, the injection craze did not settle softly into daily life. It surged, swelling through the city's veins like a tide too forceful to resist. One could see it in the mornings, when commuters filed onto trains with faces sharpened by early doses and sleep-deprived ambition. The advertisements that once displayed holiday deals and theatre shows now featured luminous silhouettes and phrases like "take control" or "refine your rhythm." They pulsed across the underground in quiet repetition, echoing Victorian pamphlets that once promised similar transformation through tinctures and tonics. One could hear it in the conversations drifting through cafes, conversations not about meals, but about their absence, not about indulgence, but about discipline. Friends compared injection schedules instead of restaurant recommendations. Brunch menus grew decorative, functioning more as table ornaments than sustenance. Croissants cooled, uneaten, beneath delicate layers of powdered sugar. The behavior, though modern in method, was Victorian in spirit. The Victorians had also embraced extremes with alarming ease. They tightened corsets until ribs bent like softened whalebone. They consumed arsenic wafers, believing they imparted luminosity. They inhaled ether at soirees until their laughter dissolved into dreamy stupor. The era prized restraint so fiercely that it became its own form of excess. To be delicate, to be slender, to be visibly untouched by hunger, these were not merely preferences, they were performances. London, in the present, had begun its own performance anew. The city's appetite, once loud, bustling, plentiful, had transformed into a kind of elegant self-denial. Restaurants dimmed their lights to soften the sight of untouched plates. Bakeries reported declining sales of morning pastries, though queues for cold brew and espresso stretched around corners. Grocery baskets grew lighter. People purchased herbs, sparkling water, and little else. The desire for refinement had grown louder than the body's whisper for nourishment. Even doctors, who had once cautioned moderation, began to speak with the strange certainty of men swept into a current stronger than their training. "It is part of modern life," they murmured, with a sympathetic tilt of the head. "The world moves too quickly for heavy meals." They said it because their patients demanded reassurance, and reassurance, regardless of accuracy, was easier than pressing the brakes on a city accelerating toward its own extremes. But London was not merely leaning toward excess, it was accelerating through it. Clinics extended hours. Pharmacies increased orders. Influencers hosted wellness evenings in softly lit lofts, where the primary activity was not eating but discussing how little they now needed to eat. A strange pride blossomed among the thinning masses, a pride rooted not in health, but in the ability to deny the body. Those who questioned the speed, the scale, the intensity, often found themselves dismissed with polite smiles, smiles that suggested concern was an outdated affectation. The injections were the future. Hunger was the past. But beneath the city's newfound elegance, beneath the delicate cheekbones and whispered claims of mental clarity, something else was humming, something uneasy, something that felt eerily familiar to historians who remembered the darker lessons of London's Victorian indulgences. For every miracle the city embraced, there had always been a shadow, one it preferred not to acknowledge until it grew too large to ignore. London had never learned restraint, and in this newest chemical chapter, the city was writing the oldest lesson once more, a lesson wrapped in fog, whispered beneath lamplight, and destined to repeat until someone, somewhere, finally slowed the rushing tide. There are moments when London feels like a city haunted not by ghosts, but by its own memory. The fog, especially in winter, carries a peculiar weight, as though it remembers things the people have forgotten or chosen to forget. It drifts between lampposts like a messenger, threading its way through alleys where Victorian footsteps once echoed, curling around rooftops that watched generations inhale miracles from corked bottles and crystal flasks. Now, as the new slimming injections tightened their grip on the city, the fog seemed to murmur old warnings that no one cared to hear. The newspapers were the first to notice the parallels. Not in bold headlines, London would never tolerate such vulgarity, but in small, elegantly printed columns tucked beside book reviews or society announcements. Words like familiar, eerily reminiscent, and an old pattern resurfacing began to appear. Cultural critics drew comparisons between the current craze and the genteel substance dependencies of the late 19th century. They wrote of ether sniffing in drawing rooms, laudanum drops taken for rest, and fashionable women lounging on fainting couches, their pupils wide, their nerves soothed by tinctures they pretended were harmless. "It seems," one columnist observed with restrained alarm, "that London once again seeks transformation through chemistry rather than conduct." Yet the articles were easy to overlook, delicate observations drowned in a city that moved too quickly to read reflections of itself. Most Londoners skimmed right past them, unwilling to see the shape of their own choices mirrored in dusty historical anecdotes. After all, the Victorians were a different people, living in a different time. Their mistakes belonged to oil paintings and sepia photographs. The modern world, clinical, sterile, enlightened, could not possibly fall into the same traps. Or so the city insisted. But the fog had other ideas. On certain evenings, when the wind changed direction and the streets glowed amber beneath the gas-like hue of old street lamps, Londoners felt a curious stillness settle over the pavements. Shadows stretched differently. The air took on the faintest scent of something chemical and sweet, as though a perfume from another century had risen from the cobblestones. Those who were sensitive to atmosphere, artists, writers, insomniacs, felt the echo most keenly. They described a sensation of déjà vu, an odd sense that the city had been here before, inhaling promises it could not quite comprehend. In Camden, a poet swore she heard the rustling of silk skirts following her along the canal, though the path behind her remained empty. In Shoreditch, a bartender reported seeing a pale figure reflected behind him in the glassware, a woman in Victorian dress, only for her image to vanish when he turned. And in Kensington, an elderly historian claimed that the scent of ether, impossible, anachronistic, lingered near a private clinic after closing hours. Whether these were imagination or memory hardly mattered. The city was beginning to hum with the same nervous energy it had once known, that mix of fascination, denial, and quiet unease that precedes a cultural unraveling. Meanwhile, the injections continued their ascent. Influencers praised them, doctors defended them, pharmacies stocked them, and those who benefited from them, the slim, the disciplined, the newly radiant, felt too triumphant to wonder whether they were simply repeating a story London had told before. For beneath the glow of street lamps and behind frosted clinic windows, the echoes grew louder. Not warnings exactly, but reminders, whispers from a fog that remembered the Victorian hunger for control, the city's infatuation with quick remedies, its blindness to costs hidden beneath refinement. London was walking a familiar path, and the fog, drifting through the night like an old storyteller, seemed determined to whisper, "You have been here before. There are obsessions that lie dormant within a culture not dead, simply sleeping, waiting for the right combination of vanity, anxiety, and opportunity to rouse them from slumber." In London, few obsessions have proven as resilient, as quietly persistent, as the dream of the impossibly narrow waist. It haunted the parlours and dressmakers' shops of the Victorian era, where women stood rigid and breathless, while corset strings tightened behind them like the winding of a clock. And now, in the city's newest chemical age, the 18-inch waist had begun to reappear, not literally, of course, but as a silhouette resurrected in aspiration. It emerged first in photographs. Faces glowed with a new sharpness, rib cages became more delicate, torsos adopted that faint taper which dressmakers once praised as the hourglass ideal. Influencers turned subtly, angling their bodies to display a cinch reminiscent of fashion plates from Queen Victoria's reign. Natural, they captioned the images, though the careful alignment of limbs and shadows told a different story. Their followers consumed these images the way Victorian women once consumed illustrated fashion journals, wistfully, enviously, earnestly. Designers responded in kind. Boutique brands released dresses with rigid seams that curved inward, gently implying a shape the wearer might or might not naturally possess. Coats narrowed subtly at the waist. Blouses skimmed the ribs with theatrical delicacy. Even the mannequins in department store windows grew slimmer by degrees, their waists no longer merely decorative but aspirational benchmarks. And so, without decree or announcement, the 18-inch waist returned to London, not as a literal measurement, but as an unspoken ideal, a ghostly standard, resurrected, refined, and plastered across billboards and screens with modern grace. In the Victorian era, the pursuit of such a waist had required breathtaking discipline. Women fainted under the weight of their own compression. They sat rigidly to protect their stays. They slept in half-laced corsets to maintain the illusion. Now, the labor was hidden beneath the skin. No gasps for air, no trembling hands grasping a fainting couch, only a quiet, chemical stillness where hunger once lived. And yet the cost, though less theatrical, was no less real. Tailors noticed the change first. A seasoned seamstress in Bloomsbury observed, with a hint of unease, that clients were requesting dresses to be taken in repeatedly, sometimes twice, in a single month. "They shrink so quickly," she whispered to her apprentice, smoothing a hand along a half-finished bodice. "It feels Victorian," the apprentice laughed, though the sound carried a nervous edge. Fitness studios reported a peculiar decline. Fewer people exercised for strength. They now exercised for shape. The focus shifted from muscle to silhouette, from vitality to slenderness, an echo of the old Victorian prioritization of appearance over well-being. Trainers, uncertain how to respond, adjusted their language. "Long lines," they said. "Elegant form." Words that could have been lifted straight from an 1880s etiquette manual. Meanwhile, older women watched the resurgence with a complicated mix of fascination and dread. They remembered their mothers' stories, corset stays digging into tender flesh, fainting spells dismissed as feminine delicacy, marriages arranged around waist measurements. They had believed such expectations had been buried with the bones of the old century. But London, it seemed, had exhumed them once more. The 18-inch waist symbol of restraint, discipline, fragility had returned as muse, ideal, and quiet tyrant. And as the city embraced it anew, one could sense the same tremor that once ran beneath the silk-covered parlors of the 19th century. The tremor of a desire so powerful it bends reason, reshapes bodies, and weaves itself into the fabric of daily life. London had not simply revived an old silhouette. It had revived an old hunger, delicate, dangerous, and as tightly bound as the corsets that once shaped a generation. There was a time not so long ago, though London pretended otherwise, when appetite was considered a simple human truth. Meals were occasions rather than moral tests. Hunger was neither virtue nor vice, merely a signal from the body calling for nourishment. But as the new injections tightened their quiet grip on the city, appetite itself began to slip into a strange category. Something mildly embarrassing, vaguely undisciplined, almost unfashionable. It began subtly, as all shifts in London society do. At first, it appeared in the language used at social gatherings. "I'm not particularly hungry," became as common as, "How lovely to see you." People smiled apologetically when served a plate, as though accepting a meal were an inconvenience they hoped not to impose upon the host. Even children were encouraged to take just a little, not because of manners, but because their parents feared appetite's return, its loudness, its undeniable humanity. The Victorian echoes were unmistakable. In that earlier century, appetite had been associated with vulgarity. Women were praised for dainty bites, for a lightness of dining as well as figure. They ate in small, composed gestures, always mindful that true refinement involved the quiet refusal of pleasure. Entire etiquette manuals were dedicated to ensuring that hunger remained hidden behind lace and propriety. Now, once again, the city had begun to blush at the sight of a robust meal. Restaurants adjusted their menus, not publicly, not officially, but quietly. Portions shrank, plates grew wider, their vast porcelain surfaces framing delicate sculptures of food that looked more like art than sustenance. Chefs, once proud of hearty British dishes, now curated meals that resembled Victorian tea sandwiches, tiny, elegant, symbolic, rather than satisfying. Servers noticed the shift with silent astonishment. "Not today," became the refrain for bread baskets. Desserts were declined with gentle, serene smiles that hinted at moral superiority. And those who still possessed ordinary appetites found themselves glancing around before lifting a fork, suddenly self-conscious of needs that had once felt natural. The pressure to be effortlessly untouched by hunger seeped into the city's corners. Office workers hid snacks in drawers, swallowing quickly when footsteps approached. Students nibbled on protein bars in solitude rather than be seen eating an actual meal. Friends praised one another for skipping lunch, as though abstention from nourishment were a mark of elegance rather than concern. But the most poignant transformation occurred in the home. Families, once anchored by shared suppers, now discovered that dinner had lost its gravity. Mothers cooked out of habit, only to watch plates return to the sink with barely a dent. Fathers reheated their meals late at night, embarrassed to eat alone. Teenage children pretended to have eaten elsewhere, adopting their parents' new rhetoric with unsettling ease. A mother in Clapham confessed quietly, guiltily to her sister, that she no longer felt hungry at all, and that this absence of want made her feel strangely triumphant. "It's as though I've risen above it," she whispered, "as though I've become refined." Refined, the very word Victorian women used when dieting themselves into faintness. Appetite was becoming not merely unnecessary, but undesirable. What London failed to see, what it refused to see, was that appetite is not a flaw to correct, but a reminder of one's own aliveness. To hunger is to feel, to want, to participate in the world. Yet as the glamour of thinness and chemical control spread through the city, the simple act of wanting food became a kind of social misstep, an old-fashioned impulse best hidden in the privacy of one's kitchen. London had not declared a war on food, it had declared a war on wanting. And somewhere in that shift, soft, elegant, almost invisible, the city slipped deeper into its Victorian shadow, where appetite was a burden, nourishment a weakness, and the rejection of hunger the most fashionable performance of all. London has always possessed a peculiar talent for disguising its vices in velvet. In the Victorian age, this talent expressed itself in the form of parlours, gilded, perfumed sanctuaries where women gathered not simply to socialise, but to inhale, sip, or swallow the newest modern marvel delivered by inventive apothecaries. Ether wafted through drawing rooms like a mischievous spirit. Laudanum rested in crystal decanters beside sherry. Cocaine wine sparkled temptingly under gaslight. These spaces were not dens of immorality, at least not publicly. They were salons of refinement, places where London's elite performed the delicate balancing act between propriety and indulgence. Now, in a century clad in glass and steel rather than brocade and mahogany, the parlours had returned, changed in appearance, but eerily identical in purpose. The modern version did not feature velvet fainting couches or carved wooden cabinets of tonics. Instead, clients reclined in minimalist wellness lounges, their interiors washed in cream and soft gold, their surfaces gleaming with the immaculate sterility of a clinic and the indulgent hush of a spa. Glass pitchers of cucumber water sat in place of laudanum decanters. Instead of a servant attending the fire, a receptionist in linen calmly adjusted the lighting to make the room seem eternally dusk-tinted, soft, flattering, non-judgmental. But beneath the serenity, the same electric anticipation hummed. Women arrived in curated outfits, cashmere coats, silk trousers, understated jewelry, each carrying the same subtle tension Victorian ladies once wore beneath their lace gloves, a need to be seen participating in the exact ritual everyone pretended was effortless. They were greeted with murmured greetings, offered herbal teas they would not drink, and guided to reclining chairs where the injections would be prepared with reverent precision. Nurses spoke softly, their tones nearly identical to Victorian companions, offering comfort before an ether inhalation. "Deep breath," they murmured. "Relax your arm." The clients complied with practiced serenity, their faces composed, their eyes gleaming. The sting of the needle was brief, almost symbolic, a modern equivalent of the first intoxicating whiff of ether. Some women came in groups, their laughter echoing off marble floors. They compared their results quietly, discreetly, using euphemisms like lighter, cleaner, more streamlined. Others came alone, slipping inside with a furtiveness reminiscent of Victorian women, seeking laudanum for nervous ailments. A few came daily, compulsively, though the injections were not meant to be administered so frequently. Their presence felt as familiar to staff as the figure of the Victorian widow who once returned for opiate tinctures under the guise of grief. There were even gatherings, modern echoes of the Victorian ether frolics. Influencers hosted wellness evenings, complete with ambient music and guided meditation, culminating in the discreet arrival of a nurse to administer a round of injections to the admiring circle. Videos of these events, softly lit and elegantly edited, garnered thousands of views. No one used the word parlour, but it hung in the air like a whispered memory. Of course, the city justified it all with the language of science. The injections were not intoxicants, the salons not indulgence, the gatherings not dependency but self-care. But history, though often ignored, remained watchful. Historians recognized the pattern, a fashionable chemical making its way into social rituals, disguised as sophistication, embraced as progress. Just as Victorian ladies sought ether to soften their anxieties and mold their bodies into delicate ideals, modern Londoners now sought the injection to sharpen their silhouettes and silence their hunger. The environment had changed, the vocabulary updated, but the yearning at the heart of it remained unchanged. For beneath the soft lighting and the tasteful decor, beneath the polite small talk and curated calm, these modern parlours served the same purpose as their Victorian ancestors: to offer an escape from the body's demands, a retreat from the weight of appetite, a quiet, elegant place to surrender to a chemical promise. And London, ever faithful to its own rituals, entered these spaces with the same trusting, trembling hope it carried into the ether-filled parlours of old. There is a peculiar elegance in the way London renames its vices. Opium once became a soother of nerves. Coca leaf elixirs were marketed as invigorating tonics. Ether, drifting through genteel parlours, was touted as a restorative vapour for frail ladies. By altering the vocabulary, the city softened the act itself, allowing its citizens to indulge without confronting the stark truth of their dependencies. Now, more than a century later, the newest object of fascination, the hunger-silencing injection, had undergone the same linguistic alchemy. It had become the modern woman's restorative, spoken with the same gentle pride Victorian women once reserved for their treasured tinctures. It was not called a drug, not an appetite suppressant, certainly not a chemical reliance. No London with its refined sensibilities clothed it in silk, a restorative, suggesting rejuvenation, renewal, a return to one's best self. Women used the term freely, almost musically. "My restorative," they would say, as they slipped their weekly appointment into their planners. "A restorative," they whispered, while opening the discreet box delivered by courier. The word offered comfort, legitimacy, an air of wellness rather than want. It suggested that the injection replenished something lacking clarity, equilibrium, elegance, rather than simply severing appetite at its root. The marketing reinforced this illusion. Advertisements showed women strolling through sunlit parks, their silhouettes graceful and elongated, the kind of figures once captured by Victorian portraitists with flattering restraint. Brochures described inner harmony, metabolic balance, and holistic renewal. They did not mention the nausea, the fatigue, the lightheadedness. Instead, they promised calmness, sharpened focus, and an almost meditative relationship with food language that mirrored 19th century pamphlets touting laudanum as a cure for restlessness and ether as an antidote to emotional storms. Even physicians adopted the euphemism, some consciously, others with unthinking ease. "The restorative will help regulate your appetite," they said with a reassuring tilt of the head, as though offering lavender sachets for sleeplessness. It became easier to prescribe, easier to justify, easier to believe in. Patients nodded gratefully, clutching their prescriptions the way Victorian women once clutched the slim blue bottles hidden in their handbags. The restorative quickly slipped into social routines. Women met for afternoon wellness teas, where no one ate but everyone exchanged progress updates, measuring their worth by lost inches rather than gained joy. One hostess in Hampstead even placed tiny glass vials on her table as centerpieces, a playful nod to the restorative culture. Guests laughed, admiring the aesthetic. No one acknowledged the shadow of its predecessor. The laudanum bottles, once displayed with identical whimsy in Victorian sitting rooms. But beneath the elegance lay discomfort quiet, almost imperceptible. Some women began to rely on their restorative, not for slimming alone, but for performance. A solicitor confided that she could only maintain her work schedule without hunger clouding her focus. A mother of 3 whispered to a friend that eating made her feel heavy, slow, unrefined. A university student admitted she feared stopping the injections because she feared the return of appetite itself, as though wanting food were a flaw of character rather than a mark of being human. The restorative had become not an aid, but a shield, thin, delicate, beautiful, and necessary. The city noticed the shift, though it pretended not to. At charity galas and gallery openings, women glided through rooms with ethereal lightness, their cheekbones prominent, their limbs fragile as fine porcelain. Applause followed them quiet, reverent, tinged with envy. London praised them for their restraint, just as it once praised Victorian ladies who ate sparingly and fainted gracefully. Yet something in the air, something beyond the fog, felt strained. There was a brittleness to the admiration, an unease behind the smiles. The restorative, like all its ancestors, was beginning to reveal itself not as a remedy, but as a dependency cloaked in refinement. London had given the injection a new, elegant name. But beneath the silk-soft language, the old longing stirred. To escape hunger, escape imperfection, escape the body itself. A longing as Victorian as the city streets that whispered it. It began with whispers, small, delicate things flitting through London's parlours and private dining rooms like nervous sparrows. At first, the city dismissed them, as it always dismisses the earliest tremors of trouble, with polite laughter, raised eyebrows, and the brittle assurance that London, modern and enlightened, was far too sophisticated to repeat the mistakes of its ancestors. Yet beneath the satin-lined civility, something unmistakable was forming, a tension, a tremor, a social panic dressed in silk gloves. The panic did not shout. It whispered. A woman in Belgravia fainted at a gallery opening gracefully, elegantly, the way Victorian ladies once did when their corsets stole too much breath. Her friends rushed to her side, all soft hands, and murmured concern. "It's nothing," she insisted once revived, but her complexion revealed a fragile translucence that could not be hidden. By morning, half the city had heard the tale, though no one spoke of it above a conspiratorial whisper. Then came the murmurs from offices, executives quietly stepping out of meetings to steady themselves in hallways, their hunger so muted that exhaustion arrived unannounced. Assistants fetched them water, fearing the optics of a collapse more than the collapse itself. And still, the explanation remained the same: overwork, stress, skipped breakfast. Not once did anyone mention the injections that had become as routine as brushing one's teeth. London preferred its illusions intact, but illusions have a way of fraying slowly at first, then all at once. At a brunch in Knightsbridge, the panic sharpened. Plates of food sat untouched, congealing under the warm glow of chandeliers. A woman observed her friend refuse every dish with serene detachment, tea only, no milk, no sugar, no food. "I simply don't want anything," the friend said, smiling with the faint, glassy-eyed calm that was becoming prevalent among the city's slimmer set. The woman felt a flicker of alarm, small, quiet, but undeniable. She lowered her fork, suddenly unsure whether eating in front of others was gauche or courageous. A strange new etiquette was forming, unspoken but widely understood. Hunger was impolite, appetite unfashionable. To eat was to confess one's ordinary humanity. Londoners had been here before. Victorian women once practiced similar restraint, nibbling at tea sandwiches so daintily that eating became more performance than nourishment. Doctors warned of wasting diseases, yet society praised these fragile figures for their ethereal refinement. Panic lived just beneath the lace, a fear that the body could betray one's social standing. Now, the lace had been replaced with designer wool, but the fear remained unchanged. The panic gained momentum when private clinics began adjusting their tone. Receptionists, once effusively reassuring, now asked new clients to complete extra forms. A few physicians quietly lengthened their consultation times, probing gently for signs of fatigue or disordered eating. Their concern was subtle, never spoken aloud, never documented in ways that could tarnish the craze, but present nonetheless. And still, London danced on, pretending not to hear the rising hum of unease beneath the music. At soirée, women whispered behind fans, modern ones, metallic and chic, replacing Victorian lace but serving the same purpose of concealing both faces and fears. They exchanged stories of friends whose heartbeats felt too slow, colleagues whose skin grew too pale, influencers whose filtered images hid a wanting that went beyond hunger. Yet even as fear spread, so did envy. This was the paradox at the heart of the panic. London was terrified of the consequences, and yet more terrified of being left behind. To refuse the injections was to risk appearing indulgent, unregulated, undisciplined. And so the panic did not halt the craze, it only made the city cling tighter, hiding its fear beneath layers of refinement. Social panic rarely announces itself with chaos. More often, it arrives quietly, in silk gloves, behind polite smiles, carried on the delicate breath of whispered worries that grow louder in the fog. By early spring, London no longer pretended it was merely flirting with the new injections. The city had fallen fully, deeply, breathlessly into their embrace. They were no longer a novelty or a whispered indulgence, they had become a quiet necessity, woven into the rhythm of life with the same inevitability as the morning fog or the chiming of church bells. London was not just using these drugs, it was depending on them. The city had become addicted not to the chemical itself, but to what it promised, a sleek, sharpened version of perfection. Perfection had always haunted London's imagination. In the Victorian era, it had appeared in the form of immaculate drawing rooms, gleaming cutlery, rigid social manners, and the slender silhouettes of tightly laced corsets. Women starved themselves behind embroidered curtains, insisting they felt quite well, even as faintness washed over them like a pale tide. Men curated their public images with equal fervor, every gesture rehearsed, every word measured. Perfection wasn't a goal, it was an obsession. And obsessions never truly die in London, they merely evolve. Now, perfection lived in the angles of cheekbones, the glide of narrow hips, the tidy precision of limbs made smaller by chemical discipline. It lived in photographs posted at golden hour, in videos where influencers moved with ethereal lightness, in office corridors where colleagues quietly admired shrinking frames while masking their own gnawing envy. If the Victorian waist had once been constricted by fabric and whalebone, the modern waist was sculpted by vials tucked discreetly into designer handbags, and London could not look away. Even those who resisted at first, the pragmatic, the skeptical, the medically cautious, found themselves drifting toward curiosity. A writer confessed to her friend over coffee that she felt out of step with the city, as though her body alone had missed the memo. "Everyone looks so refined," she said, her voice soft with both longing and resentment. A banker, noticing the transformation of his colleagues, booked a private consultation under the guise of research. A mother in Richmond, watching the elegant mothers at school pickup, wondered whether her own figure appeared indulgent in comparison. The city's addiction was not chemical, it was aspirational. Perfection shimmered everywhere, and once seen, it became impossible to ignore. Billboards depicted women with luminous skin and impossible silhouettes. Boutique fitness studios promised to enhance and complement your injection journey. High-end clothing brands released capsule collections designed to drape beautifully on bodies that had embraced the new aesthetic. Even restaurants adjusted, introducing smaller plates, photographing well, consumable only by those who wished to pick delicately at art rather than eat. The pressure was immense, but elegantly disguised. Londoners spoke of wellness, balance, and intentional living. They claimed the injections provided clarity, discipline, ease. But beneath the polished language lay a deeper truth. They feared the return of imperfection. They feared hunger, softness, desire, the very things that made them human. In turning to the injections, they were not chasing thinness alone. They were chasing control. Control so absolute it bordered on anesthetic. And like all addictions, it demanded escalating commitment. Some increased their doses without consulting doctors. Others visited unregulated clinics late at night, where practitioners made quiet promises for cash. A few scrolled through online forums, trading tips on how to prolong the effects, how to suppress cravings even further, how to maintain the illusion even as their bodies begged for reprieve. Meanwhile, the city applauded. Compliments fell like warm light upon those who conformed. Strangers admired them, friends envied them, social media anointed them. And nothing fuels addiction faster than validation, especially when wrapped in refinement. London was caught in the same gilded trap that once gripped its Victorian ancestors. An unwavering, unrelenting belief that perfection, however defined by its era, was worth pursuing at any cost. Even if the cost was invisible, even if the cost was hunger, even if the cost was the quiet undoing of the city itself, perfection, once again, had become London's favourite poison. And London, with open palms and trembling devotion, drank deeply. There are corners of London where history lingers more stubbornly than fog, old streets where the brickwork seems to breathe, where iron railings whisper in the wind, where certain shop fronts retain the faint scent of something sweet and chemical, like a memory refusing to fade. These were the streets where the ghosts of Victorian apothecaries still walked. And as London embraced its new injections, these ghosts stirred, drifting beneath the city's polished surface like warnings no one wished to acknowledge. The apothecaries of old London had been temples of transformation long before modern clinics claimed the title. Their shelves were lined with amber bottles containing secrets, laudanum tinctures promising sleep, ether offering transcendence, cocaine wine granting stamina and lightness. Customers stepped over their thresholds with a reverence that bordered on worship. They whispered ailments, nerves, exhaustion, appetite, and received glass vials cupped gently between their palms like newborn birds. Those apothecaries had vanished, replaced by boutiques, cafes, galleries. Yet something of them remained, not in signage or fragrance, but in atmosphere. The modern injection craze had resurrected that atmosphere with uncanny precision. On certain evenings, when the light slanted just so through glazed windows, Londoners standing in modern pharmacies felt a shiver of déjà vu. The faint clink of glassware sounded too familiar. The soft murmur of reassurance from pharmacists carried echoes of Victorian chemists calming anxious clients. Even the packaging, sleek, compact, discreet, seemed a distant cousin to the ornate bottles once wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Some noticed these similarities and spoke of them half-jokingly. "Feels like stepping into a 19th century novel," one woman laughed as she collected her injection. "It's all very apothecary chic," remarked a man. admiring the aesthetic while ignoring the unease settling in the room. But others felt something deeper, something unsettled. A young barista in Soho swore that when she passed a certain private clinic at dusk, she smelled ether, faint and fleeting, as if carried on the hem of a long-dead chemist's coat. A historian, leaving a lecture, paused outside a wellness lounge and murmured, "It smells exactly like the tincture shops in old manuscripts." And in Notting Hill, an elderly woman stopped in front of a refurbished apothecary sign, turned facade and whispered, "I've been here before," though she had not. Of course, no ghosts truly haunted the city, but memory did. Memory, persistent and perfumed, hovered in the spaces where modern medicine repeated old patterns. Behind every polished counter lay a familiar transaction, the exchange of money for relief, of fear for promise, of vulnerability for control. Victorian women stepped into apothecaries seeking to silence their nerves. Modern women stepped into clinics seeking to silence their hunger. The specifics changed, the longing did not. And in that longing, the ghosts found their footing. The strangest sightings occurred in the oldest parts of the city: Bloomsbury, Kensington, Limehouse, where apothecaries had once thrived. People reported glimpsing faint figures in vintage dress reflected in pharmacy windows. A woman in a high-collared gown, a man with a top hat and regretful eyes. Always fleeting, always when one looked indirectly. A trick of the light, a trick of the mind. But the impression lingered like a smudge on glass. It wasn't ghosts that Londoners were seeing. It was themselves reflected through the lens of a century-old story they had forgotten. The old apothecaries had been filled with promises that dissolved into dependency. Now, the new injections carried promises wrapped in the sterile glow of science, yet whispered the same seductive tune. Hush your hunger. Trust the bottle or the vial. Become lighter. Become smaller. Become refined. And so the ghost stayed, not to haunt, but to warn. For the walls of London remembered everything. The tremble of a gloved hand reaching for laudanum. The first breath of ether beneath flickering gaslight. The stifled gasp of a woman who felt her world sharpen too quickly. Now they watched as new hands reached for new remedies, as history repeated itself with modern packaging and Victorian fervor. The ghosts in the apothecary were not apparitions. They were echoes. Echoes trying, softly and sorrowfully, to speak. Every era has its public face and its private one. London, master of duality, perfected the art long before the first injection ever touched a fashionable arm. In drawing rooms fragrant with bergamot and warmed by soft lamplight, the city displayed its elegance. Pale silk gowns, perfectly composed smiles, a cultivated air of restraint. But behind those velvet curtains, behind the heavy drapes and gilt mirrors, another London took shape. One where the desperation beneath the thinning silhouettes began to flicker through, uninvited and undeniable. It appeared first in the quiet moments, in the way a woman's hand trembled, ever so slightly, as she fastened a bracelet around her delicate wrist. In the way a man normally poised leaned a bit too heavily against a mantelpiece during a soirée, insisting he was just tired. In the way conversations faltered when canapés passed by. Noticing eyes that lingered too long, not in temptation but in something closer to grief. Hunger had not disappeared. It had merely been smothered, pressed down like a restless child beneath a heavy quilt. And now it was beginning to stir. The desperation was subtle. London excelled at subtlety. It never screamed, it whispered. But those whispers grew louder as the weeks passed. A hostess in Pimlico noticed her guests no longer stayed late. They left early, drifting into the fog with ghost-like movements, claiming early appointments or restless children. She suspected, privately, they simply could not withstand the exertion of socializing while their bodies remained deprived of sustenance. Yet she said nothing. To speak it aloud would be impolite. Worse, it would be unfashionable. In Chelsea, a tailor recounted a strange encounter with a long-time client. The woman demanded her garments be taken in drastically for the third time that month. When she fainted in the fitting room, collapsing among the swathes of silk meant to adorn her shrinking form, she insisted, still pale, still trembling, that she had simply stood too quickly. Her denial was firm. Her desperation was clearer still. In Mayfair, a once celebrated actress cancelled an appearance at the last moment. A touch of illness, her publicist claimed. But those close to her knew the truth. Her energy had vanished entirely. The very thought of climbing the stairs to the stage left her breathless with exhaustion. Yet she clung to the injections with silent fervor, terrified that stopping would return her to a softness the industry found unforgivable. And all across the city, people who had once embraced the injections as convenience now clutched them as lifelines. The desperation did not discriminate by wealth or status. A university student in Shoreditch found her world narrowing to the weekly dose, her hunger gone, yes, but so too her joy, her focus, her sense of self. A middle-aged banker in Canary Wharf woke in the night with a hollowness that felt less like emptiness and more like something vital slipping away. A mother in Dulwich studied her children's dinner plates with a bewildering mix of envy and repulsion, unable to reconcile her bodily needs with the standards she felt compelled to meet. These were not people chasing beauty alone. They were people who felt trapped between expectation and fear. Fear of gaining, fear of slowing, fear of no longer belonging to the shimmering, ever-narrowing world London demanded. But none of this showed in public. In front of others, Londoners maintained their composure with Victorian precision. They stood tall. They smiled faintly. They moved lightly across polished floors. They spoke of wellness, balance, clarity. It was only behind the velvet curtain, behind locked bathroom doors, behind whispered confessions, behind moments of solitude that the truth seeped through like ink, bleeding into fine linen. The city was not merely transforming, it was unraveling, one faint tremor at a time. And those who had embraced the injections so eagerly now clung to them with a quiet desperation, terrified that without them, everything, status, beauty, belonging, would collapse like a corset unlaced too quickly. London had cultivated control, but behind its velvet curtains, control was slipping, and hunger, banished but not defeated, was beginning to press its palm against the door. There are moments when history does not simply echo, it reaches out, softly yet unmistakably, as though a gloved hand were placing itself upon one's wrist. London, with all its modern brilliance and polished ambition, began to feel that touch during the height of the injection craze. A gentle tightening, a soft reminder, a pressure that said, "You have been here before." It happened first in subtleties, a kind of atmospheric déjà vu. Women noticed, with a faint shiver of recognition, that their vanity tables resembled those of their great-grandmothers. Not in decor gone were the carved mahogany boxes, the lace doilies, the tiny scissors meant for trimming ribbons. But in spirit, the resemblance was uncanny. Then, cobalt bottles of laudanum hidden behind perfume flacons. Now, chilled vials nestled discreetly beside serums and creams. Then, doses taken in secret. Now, doses punctuating the week with the same breathless expectation. The past was not repeating. It was returning. In Shoreditch, a young woman sorting her late grandmother's belongings found an old handwritten note tucked inside a jewelry box, a dosage reminder for nerve drops written in swirling Victorian script. She felt a strange tightening in her chest as she placed the note beside her own modern injection schedule. The handwriting differed. The purpose did not. Across the river, an archivist cataloguing Victorian health pamphlets felt chills reading advertisements that praised new methods of appetite suppression for the refined lady. The descriptions delicate, scientific, discreet, could have been lifted directly from the marketing campaigns, adorning London's underground stations. She paused, staring at the pages with a growing sense of unease. The ink had faded, the warning had not. Even those with no interest in history found themselves feeling strangely haunted. A barrister in Westminster, walking past a refurbished apothecary, stopped suddenly, overwhelmed by the sensation that someone, some era was watching him. He could not explain it. He simply felt observed, as though London itself were leaning over his shoulder, whispering, "Look closely. Notice what you've revived." In Belgravia, a designer preparing a new fashion line cut silhouettes sharper and slimmer than anything she'd drawn before. She felt inspired, brilliant, but also uneasy. The shapes seemed familiar, though she could not place why. It wasn't until she visited the V&A's costume archive that she understood. Her sketches mirrored 19th century corsetry, those severe, breathless forms sculpted not by fabric, but by ambition. London had not asked for this resurrection, but it accepted it eagerly. The past did more than whisper, it showed itself plainly in behavior. Women began hiding their weaknesses, the way their Victorian predecessors hid fainting spells behind embroidered fans. Men began praising thinness under the guise of health, echoing the old Victorian fixation with moral discipline. Conversations about appetite grew tinged with shame, just as they had in parlours lit by gaslight. A strange hitch entered the voices of those who spoke about stopping the injections. They sounded like Victorian addicts, insisting they could put the laudanum bottle away tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. And so the past tightened its hold not violently, but insistently. A hand on the wrist, steering gently, whispering, "Look where this leads." But London, as always, refused to listen. The city believed itself too modern, too informed, too enlightened to fall prey to the same trap twice. It convinced itself the resemblance was superficial, an aesthetic coincidence, nothing more. Its citizens dismissed the historical parallels as romantic exaggerations, the ghosts as imagination. Yet even the skeptics felt it, a faint pressure, like someone drawing them backward through time. For history does not return without purpose. It arrives when its lessons have been forgotten. And now, as injections replaced tinctures, and slimness replaced sustenance, and vanity replaced sense, the past reached for London's wrist, not to punish, but to warn, that every era believes its choices are new. Until the fog rises, the lamplight flickers, and the old patterns reappear, more familiar than anyone dares admit. It was at the dining table, a place once sacred for both nourishment and society, that London's modern obsession revealed its most striking power. Plates, arranged with meticulous care, gleamed beneath the soft glow of pendant lamps. Silver cutlery lay in perfect alignment. Glasses caught the lamplight like captured stars. In Victorian times, such a table had signaled civility and abundance, a space where etiquette tamed appetite and conversation tempered desire. Now, it served a different purpose, a stage for absence, a theatre of controlled hunger. The injection had made the difference. One delicate press of the plunger, one subtle prick to the wrist, and the body, once a noisy, insistent participant in daily ritual, grew silent. No rumble of stomach, no pang of desire, no glance toward the steaming roast or the carefully sliced pâté. Hunger, that most primal and human signal, had become a forgotten language, replaced by a chemical stillness. Guests at dinner parties, accustomed to Victorian propriety, adapted quickly. They smiled, sipped, conversed, and yet their plates remained largely untouched. Conversations turned to fashion, art, or the latest social engagement. Occasionally, someone would lift a fork, if only to rearrange the food, to signal participation without succumbing to appetite. There was an unspoken understanding. To eat too eagerly was to betray oneself, to hint at a bodily craving that could no longer be tolerated. In the quiet shimmer of the candlelight, The table had become a display of self-mastery, nervous energy masked as grace, discipline masquerading as refinement. Servants moved with silent attentiveness. They cleared uneaten courses, noting subtle tremors in the hands of those they served. Were these tremors remnants of fatigue or echoes of suppressed desire? It was impossible to say. Silence reigned, and silence in London's dining rooms had always carried weight. In Victorian parlours, it had meant delicacy. Now it meant dependence. In kitchens, the effect was felt acutely. Chefs, who once prided themselves on creating sumptuous meals, now watched as their artistry went largely unconsumed. The familiar aromas of roasted meats and simmering sauces lingered in the air, unsampled and growing faint, like ghosts of tradition. Families that had gathered around tables, once bound by shared appetite and conversation, found themselves dispersed in quiet contemplation. The injection had changed the very rhythm of domestic life, replacing bodily needs with chemical promise. Even children became complicit. Observing the behavior of their elders, they learned quickly that appetite was an inconvenience, a flaw best concealed. They nibbled cautiously, imitating the silence and restraint of those who had mastered the chemical control. Playful curiosity was tempered by observation. The city's newest etiquette dictated that desire must be managed, hidden, sanitized. The parallels to Victorian history were unmistakable. Once, women had fainted from tight corsets. Now, they merely pressed a syringe to their skin. Once, opiates dulled nerves and restrained hunger. Now, the injection dulled craving with precision. The table remained central, yet its function had shifted from sustenance to performance, from nourishment to demonstration. Absence had become the new adornment, discipline the most coveted delicacy. By evening's end, the room was filled with polite smiles, soft laughter, and untouched food. The chemical silence was complete, the performance flawless. Yet beneath it all, a subtle unease lingered, an echo of the past, reminding the city that mastery without balance is fragile, and absence without understanding can be perilous. London had learned to dine in appearance alone, to consume in manners and restraint rather than appetite. And the injection, like the tinctures of old, had taught the city a new, chilling grace, that one could appear perfect while the body quietly whispered for more. The kitchens of London, once filled with the reassuring clatter of pots and pans and the fragrant hum of simmering meals, had grown strangely quiet. Even in homes where the hearth burned brightly and the scent of fresh bread wafted upward, the tables below remained disturbingly still. The injection had altered more than appetites. It had reshaped the very rhythm of domestic life, quieting not only hunger, but the subtle chaos that accompanies the preparation and enjoyment of food. In the Victorian era, kitchens were both stage and sanctuary. Mothers stirred stews with the precision of conductors, daughters set the table with almost ceremonial care, and servants moved like shadows between flame and floorboards, orchestrating the ballet of sustenance. Conversations, laughter, scoldings, and requests for tastings all interwove with the clamour of utensils and the hiss of boiling liquids. Appetite was active, unavoidable, an essential rhythm of the household. Now, that rhythm had softened, replaced by a silence that seemed deliberate, almost reverential. Plates were prepared, arranged, and left untouched. Bread cooled on cutting boards, spoons lay beside half-filled bowls of porridge. Even children, who in centuries past would have clamoured for a taste of honeyed treats or warm toast, sat quietly, distracted by books, screens, or the faintly metallic gleam of an untouched fork. They understood, instinctively, that hunger was not only undesirable, but a breach of propriety in this new chemical age. Mothers and fathers, too, felt the subtle weight of expectation. Some poured cups of tea without pouring any milk, out of habit or perhaps guilt. Others placed slices of cake on plates, only to watch them remain inviolate. Each ignored the inner stirrings of their own appetite in favor of maintaining the appearance of control, a control that was increasingly enforced not by willpower but by the injection, that small vial of promise that silenced desire with surgical precision. The silence extended beyond the domestic walls. Neighborhoods, once animated by the aromas of evening suppers and the faint laughter of shared meals, seemed to fold inward. Windows, even when open, let in little more than the soft murmur of gas lamps and distant footsteps. The culinary pulse of London had dimmed, leaving an almost eerie stillness in its wake, as though the city itself were holding its breath. And yet, the absence of hunger brought a peculiar tension. Kitchen tables, though empty, were not free from anxiety. The quiet carried with it a subtle unease, an intangible pressure that seemed to whisper reminders of earlier eras. Victorian women had fainted from tight corsets. Children had been deprived of meals to satisfy societal expectation. Opiates and tonics had been administered with quiet, pervasive authority. The lessons of restraint and obsession echoed faintly beneath the sterilized surfaces and gleaming countertops of modern kitchens. Servants, when present, moved with a new sort of vigilance. They refilled teapots, wiped counters, and adjusted chairs, all the while observing the faint paleness of their employers, the delicate tremor in a hand raised to pour milk. It was as though the quiet itself demanded attention, a silent warning that perfection maintained through chemical means carried consequences, invisible to the eye, but palpable to the body. In these hushed kitchens, London's households rehearsed a ritual as old as the city itself, the performance of control, the suppression of desire, the polite cultivation of absence. The injection made it seamless, efficient, almost invisible. Yet beneath every empty plate and untouched slice of bread, the city felt a memory stirring a faint, disquieting echo of a past, when restraint, however polished, had exacted a hidden toll. London had mastered the art of quiet dining. But in the hush, one could hear the faintest heartbeat of what had been lost. The warmth of shared meals, the honest call of appetite, and the delicate chaos that once made kitchens feel alive. Patience, like appetite, is a fragile commodity in London, and in recent weeks it had begun to grow thin. Once, the city had been celebrated for its composure, the polite restraint of carriage lines, the measured cadence of social introductions, the delicate negotiation of conversation across polished dinner tables. But now, under the shadow of the new injections, a subtle restlessness had begun to ripple through society, almost imperceptibly at first, like a barely audible tremor beneath a polished floor. The change was most visible in the drawing rooms of Belgravia and Mayfair, where ladies and gentlemen convened for afternoon teas, gallery viewings, and charity functions. Conversations, once patient and leisurely, now carried a clipped edge. Words were chosen more carefully, silences filled with an unspoken awareness of appearances. The injection had not only quieted hunger, but sharpened self-scrutiny, intensifying the scrutiny applied to others. Every gesture, every expression, every inch of silhouette became a subtle performance, a testament to the discipline imposed not by will but by chemistry. In Victorian times, patience had been a social virtue, exercised through endless rituals of propriety. Women endured tight stays, suppressing discomfort to maintain appearance. Men navigated etiquette with the careful calibration of voices and posture. Even children learned to wait sometimes hours for the reward of a measured treat, their desires tempered by expectation and hierarchy. The city prized endurance as much as accomplishment, celebrating the ability to inhabit social spaces without succumbing to haste or hunger. Now, that endurance had become selective. Patience remained, but only in service of the ideal, the appearance of control. Missed cues, delayed appointments, or slight imperfections in behavior provoked subtle, almost imperceptible reactions. An elegantly raised eyebrow, a curt nod, the faint tightening of lips, these small signals communicated disappointment, disapproval, or impatience without a single word. Guests became acutely aware of each other's conduct, as though society itself had become a mirror, reflecting not only beauty but the cost of deviation. At private gatherings, the effects were more pronounced. Hosts noticed that conversations tended to drift, that attention spans shortened, that subtle impatience simmered beneath the surface. A hostess serving tea observed her guests fidgeting with napkins, checking their watches, glancing toward the exit with barely contained eagerness. Plates remained untouched, not because of appetite, but because the slightest delay in consumption, any breach of schedule, felt intolerable. Social grace had become conditional, tethered tightly to the rhythms imposed by the injections. Even in professional spaces, the pattern was evident. Boardrooms, lecture halls, and law offices all displayed a similar tension. Colleagues whispered anxiously about efficiency, subtly assessing the energy of each participant, measuring endurance against expectation. The injection had transformed human patience into a delicate veneer, a composure maintained chemically, a calmness that masked a growing impatience for imperfection. The city itself seemed to sense the change. Streets, parks, and cafes were populated by individuals who moved with remarkable precision, each step calculated, each pause measured. Even the fog seemed to linger differently, curling around bodies with the suggestion of urgency, pressing lightly against shoulders as if urging them onward. It was a London simultaneously composed and taut, serene and tautly wound, a city of polished veneers hiding restless pulses beneath. Patience had not vanished. It had been refined, sharpened, and made conditional. In the subtle pressure of social expectation, in the quiet anticipation of observation, Londoners learned anew that society rewards those who endure beautifully, who wait gracefully, and who conceal the stirrings of hunger and desire beneath the perfect surface. Yet the lesson came with an invisible cost: the thinning of tolerance, the shrinking of empathy, the quiet erosion of the patience that had once bound the city together. In this chemically refined calm, London teetered on the edge of elegance and tension, unsure which would prevail. London has always been a city attuned to the rhythms of its own ambition, and in recent months those rhythms had aligned perfectly with the promise of the new injections. The drug was not merely a convenience, it was a symbol, a vessel into which the anxieties, desires, and vanities of an entire era could be poured. It was a solution crafted for the peculiar pressures of the modern metropolis, a chemical answer to questions that Londoners had always asked, though in different guises, in different centuries. In the drawing rooms of Chelsea and Kensington, women regarded it as a miracle, a discreet vial capable of silencing hunger, of smoothing moods, of restoring a sense of composure lost amid the relentless pace of city life. The advertisements, carefully curated and artfully designed, promised wellness, balance, and elegance, but beneath the language lay something deeper: the restoration of control. For London, control has always been both obsession and necessity. Victorians constrained themselves with corsets and tonics, measured every bite, counted every sip. Now, the chemical had replaced laces and powders, but the underlying need remained unchanged. The injection was tailored for this city, for this era. It accommodated the demands of work, the pressures of social performance, and the insistent gaze of peers and family. It allowed women to glide through luncheons with polished calm, to stride down the streets of Mayfair with an ethereal ease, to participate in society without the inconvenient interruptions of appetite. Men, too, discovered the convenience of moderation. Meetings stretched longer, mornings began earlier, focus sharpened, tempers eased. The city, bustling as ever, seemed to breathe a quieter, more ordered air. Yet the allure was not purely practical. The drug carried with it a promise of elegance, a suggestion that to be refined is to be restrained. And London, as it always has, responded to the promise with eagerness. It was a city that delights in appearances, that measures success not merely by accomplishment, but by the quiet perfection with which it is presented. To master appetite, to command one's body with invisible precision, became a new form of social currency, an invisible medal awarded for conformity to the era's exacting ideals. In private homes, the drug transformed domestic life. Dinner tables, once sites of convivial chaos, were now composed stages where restraint was displayed like a piece of art. Guests nibbled, sipped, adjusted their posture, and engaged in conversation, all with the silent knowledge that the injections were keeping their hunger, and thus their imperfections, at bay. Even children absorbed the lesson, learning quickly that appetite was inconvenient and restraint admirable, that the perfect silhouette was the new standard of propriety. The parallels to Victorian practices were subtle but unmistakable. Tinctures, tonics, and ether had promised refinement, quiet, and elegance. They had delivered control at a price invisible until it was too late. The modern injection did the same, now wrapped in the cloak of science, credibility, and clinical precision. The promise was seductive, the compliance voluntary yet inevitable. Yet beneath the surface, unease lingered. The city had always paid for its obsession with control, often in private rooms, whispered confidences, and fainting spells. Now, the cost was more hidden, subtler, but no less real. The injection silenced appetite, but not anxiety. It shaped bodies, but not the unrest that simmered beneath the surface. The chemical balm calmed the senses, but the city's ghosts, the ghosts of corsets, of tinctures, of carefully measured doses watched from the corners of drawing rooms and the quiet recesses of memory. London had discovered a drug for its times, convenient, precise, elegant. Yet even as the city embraced it, it remained tethered to the lessons of its past, aware if only faintly that every solution carries its own shadow. The drug promised control, and the city, as ever, reached eagerly for it. London has long understood the power of observation, the delicate, unspoken evaluation that occurs when one's every gesture is witnessed by peers. In the Victorian era, it manifested in the strict choreography of parlours, the subtle judgment carried behind fans, the careful arrangement of posture and expression to convey refinement. Now, in the glow of modern gaslight and electricity, that same scrutiny had found new vessels, influencers, those arbiters of appearance, whose images circulated like whispered secrets, amplified 1,000-fold. They were visible everywhere, though rarely in person. Cafes in Marylebone and Mayfair buzzed quietly with the hum of cameras and soft discussion, but the true stage existed online, where polished images and short, curated videos captured every angle of their subjects. Smiles were faintly tilted, eyes luminous, torsos and limbs adjusted with almost imperceptible precision. A tilt of the chin, a subtle lean, a hand resting on the hip, these gestures conveyed discipline and elegance, the same signals once communicated by the slight tightening of a corset or the careful lift of a fan. In these digital parlors, the injections played a central role. They were not mentioned overtly, of course, but their effect was unmistakable. Waistlines were sharper, arms more refined, the posture so effortless it seemed almost ethereal. Followers watched and emulated. Tutorials appeared discreetly how to maintain appearance, how to move gracefully, how to enhance the effect without apparent effort. Advice flowed in soft, coded language, as subtle and precise as Victorian etiquette manuals. Keep your hand near the vase, but do not touch it. Angle your body just so. Smile lightly, but let the eyes speak. The influence was intoxicating. Young women, once guided by glossy magazines and society gossip, now tracked the hours of posting, the placement of light, the curve of a shoulder. Men observed the same patterns with measured admiration, assessing professional colleagues and casual acquaintances alike. The city, as it had always done, learned to perform its own evaluation with delicate precision, weighing composure against curiosity, elegance against imperfection. And yet, the modern parlour held a subtle menace, much as Victorian salons had concealed risks behind the shimmer of wealth and propriety. Influencers, like their predecessors, projected control and confidence, but the veneer was not infallible. There were occasional moments of strain and unguarded expression, a faint flush, the twitch of a hand that hinted at the labour beneath the ease. Followers, attuned to the unspoken, noticed these fissures. Rumours circulated, carefully couched in admiration or concern. "She looks so composed, but I wonder if it is effortless." The injections, while silent and unseen, were understood to maintain the perfection on display, sustaining the illusion of control while quiet desperation persisted behind the lens. In the quiet of the evening, after posts had gone live and the city's screens glowed dimly in the fog, the influence persisted. Even those untouched by the injections felt its reach. Walks through the streets of Soho, Westminster, and Chelsea carried the subtle awareness that every gesture, every step, every silhouette might be under scrutiny. London had always demanded conformity, and now conformity had taken on a chemical and digital dimension, spreading invisibly through images and mirrored behaviours. The Victorian legacy was unmistakable. Just as ladies of the 19th century had leaned toward fainting couches, discreet tonics, and whispered approvals to signal refinement, modern Londoners now lean toward filtered images, curated posts, and chemical moderation to achieve the same ends. Gaslight and screen light intertwined, blending past and present as the city measured itself against ideals both ancient and contemporary. Influencers had become the modern arbiters of propriety. The injections, the tables, the filtered images, they were the instruments. And London, ever obedient to its own reflection, watched, copied, and whispered approval through the fog, knowing that the dance of perfection had always required a witness. In London, the body has always been a landscape of fascination and anxiety, a site where science and society converge in delicate, often perilous, scrutiny. The Victorians had approached it with tinctures and tonics, ether and laudanum, all promising mastery over appetite, nerves, and visible refinement. Now, in the modern age of injections, the city confronted the same landscape anew, though with a veneer of precision, clinical reassurance, and scientific language that made the mysteries appear rational and controlled. Yet, beneath the polished surface, the body remained an enigmatic terrain, whispering truths no measurement could fully capture. Physicians spoke with confidence, referencing metabolic pathways, hormones, and insulin sensitivity, as though the secrets of appetite had been entirely decoded. They explained that the injection would suppress cravings, regulate energy, and subtly recalibrate the signals that once commanded hunger. Their lectures, delivered with the authority of long white coats and polished stethoscopes, were meant to reassure. They framed the drug as a triumph of modern science, a tool designed to bring harmony to the body's chaotic orchestra. And yet, patients discovered quickly that harmony was never guaranteed. Some felt the subtle tug of fatigue, a light-headedness that betrayed the absence of ordinary hunger. Others experienced tingling or mild nausea, sensations that the glossy pamphlets quietly acknowledged, but the drawing room conversations ignored. In Victorian times, fainting had been a performance of refinement. Now these physiological disturbances were concealed behind serene expressions, soft gestures, and the artful manipulation of angles in mirrors and photographs. The effect was the same. The city prized appearances above all else, even when the body protested. The mysteries of metabolism became a topic of fascination, discussed quietly in cafes and parlors. Friends compared experiences with the subtle intensity of Victorian ladies, discussing the fainting effects of tonics and ether. One woman noted her wrist felt lighter, her step more delicate, yet her energy seemed diminished in ways that were difficult to describe. Another confessed that the injection silenced appetite, but amplified a strange preoccupation with control, a lingering anxiety about the slightest deviation from the ideal. These private observations were spoken softly, often behind fans or screens, as though the truths themselves might evaporate if voiced too loudly. Even those who approached the injection purely for its aesthetic promise could not escape the metabolic whispers of the body. In kitchens and offices, living rooms and trains, subtle effects made themselves felt. A flutter of dizziness when standing too quickly, an unexpected shiver, a faint emptiness that did not correspond to any logical deprivation. The body, despite the clinical precision of modern science, remained its own sovereign entity, resistant to absolute control. And yet, Londoners embraced the mystery as part of the allure. Just as Victorian women had marveled at the invisible effects of tinctures and tonics, so too did the modern elite admire the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts wrought by the injections. It was a demonstration not merely of discipline, but of participation in a carefully curated ritual, a dance between observation and self-mastery that extended from the drawing room to the cafe, from the office to the photographic lens. The metabolic mysteries were both fascination and warning, invisible, delicate, yet persistent. They reminded the city that the body, however refined, cannot be entirely mastered. It will whisper, tremble, resist, and assert itself even under the most polished of interventions. London, as ever, ignored the warning in favor of elegance. It measured itself against appearance, praised by peers and screens alike, while the body continued its quiet, insistent murmur beneath. The city pursued perfection with science in one hand, vanity in the other, and a faint, persistent hum of metabolic mystery threading between the two. Invisible yet undeniable, London is a city of appearances, and appearances have always carried more weight than realities. In the refined parlours of the Victorian era, women fainted with elegance, while tonics of laudanum or drops of ether dulled their nerves and sharpened their silhouettes. The fainting was celebrated as delicacy, the remedies praised as ingenuity. Now, in the modern age of injections, the city witnessed a subtler, quieter manifestation of the same pattern. Side effects, carefully hidden, whispered, almost invisible, yet undeniably present. The side effects did not announce themselves with violence. There were no convulsions, no dramatic swoons, no gasps in drawing rooms illuminated by gaslight. They arrived in whispers, in the faint tremble of a hand, in an unexpected fatigue that lingered like a shadow across the shoulders. A woman in South Kensington, who had injected her restorative earlier that morning, noticed her thoughts growing hazy during a board meeting. Her body felt lighter, her hunger silenced, yet her mind seemed to drift as though tethered by invisible threads. She smiled through the haze, a gesture perfected in mirrors, hiding the quiet toll of perfection. Others found themselves afflicted by subtler distortions, a fluttering heartbeat when rising too quickly, a chill crawling along the spine when the air in a drawing room shifted, a pale tremor in the fingertips while holding a teacup. These were not crises, not events that demanded attention from a physician. They were disturbances, almost polite in their intrusiveness, as though the body, despite chemical persuasion, insisted on reminding its occupant of its presence. In domestic spheres, these effects became quietly conspicuous. Mothers moved more deliberately when preparing breakfast, conscious of a faint dizziness that made once simple motions precarious. Children watched, noting the subtle changes, learning the new etiquette of measured consumption and restrained movement. Guests visiting London townhouses felt the atmosphere tighten imperceptibly, sensing a delicate tension in the air, the energy of bodies managing themselves chemically, yet betraying slight, almost imperceptible signs of strain. The comparison to Victorian times was not lost on historians or the perceptive few who studied the patterns. Then, tonic use had delivered beauty at a cost, masked behind polite feinting, whispered reassurances, and careful concealment. Now, the injections offered a similar bargain: ease, refinement, and composure in exchange for subtle disturbances, quietly endured, rarely acknowledged. The city accepted them without protest, as it had always accepted the delicate price of elegance. Even the most public manifestations were muted. Influencers and socialites posted images of slender silhouettes, radiant faces, and poised gestures, with no hint of the fatigue, tremors, or mental fog lurking just beneath the surface. Online forums discussed dosage with clinical precision, but only hinted at the faint disturbances that accompanied strict adherence. It was a culture of concealment, polished to a veneer of sophistication, underpinned by silent cost. And yet, beneath the calm, London felt the stirrings of unease. Whispered observations travelled from kitchen to parlour, cafe to office. "She seems lighter, more composed, but I wonder at what cost," one would murmur, only to be reassured by the collective nod of those too polite to probe further. The city, as always, prioritized appearance over acknowledgement, elegance over caution. The silent side effects became a testament to the enduring truth. No chemical, however modern, could fully subdue the human body. Appetite may be quieted, posture refined, waistlines narrowed, yet the body patient, persistent and insistent, retains its own language, spoken in tremors, fatigue, and subtle disturbances, visible only to those who look closely enough. London embraced the promise of perfection, and beneath the glow of lamplight, behind the polished veneer, the body whispered its quiet dissent, unseen but unmistakable. London has always known the comforting allure of discretion, the gentle reassurance of hidden sanctuaries where troubles may be hushed and secrets treated with polite indulgence. In the Victorian era, the apothecary and the private parlour offered such refuge, a faintly perfumed room where tinctures and tonics promised serenity, elegance, and refinement. Now, in this modern age, those sanctuaries had returned in a new form, clinics of consolation, discreet, sanitized, and polished, offering a chemical reprieve from the demands of appetite, society, and self. The clinics emerged first in residential streets, their brass signage modest, their interiors restrained to the point of austerity. Yet a closer glance revealed soft carpets, warm lighting, and chairs upholstered to cradle the body as though it were precious porcelain. Gentle music, almost imperceptible, drifted through corridors, a modern echo of the soft whispers and piano chords that once soothed Victorian nerves in similar spaces. Even the air was treated filtered, humidified, scented, with faint traces of lavender and antiseptic, a combination meant to calm both mind and body. Patients arrived punctually, carrying small cases or designer handbags, eyes bright but careful. They were greeted with whispers and soft smiles, guided to consultation rooms where the injection would be prepared with deliberate precision. Nurses moved with a practiced calm, their hands steady, their voices low, reminding one of Victorian attendants administering ether to those faint of heart or constitution. A soft, reassuring touch, a gentle pressure on the wrist, a carefully measured dosage, each gesture performed with ceremonial exactitude. It was not simply a medical act, it was a ritual of reassurance, a private affirmation of control in a world increasingly demanding refinement. These clinics functioned as both refuge and stage. Inside, the patient could surrender the chaotic demands of hunger, momentarily stepping outside the world's scrutiny. The injection quieted appetite, smoothed the edges of fatigue, and conferred a subtle calm, allowing composure to reign over both thought and gesture. The effect was immediate, delicate, and almost ethereal, the body yielding without complaint, the mind quieted, the appearance refined. Yet, beneath the surface, the clinics carried a shadow of their Victorian predecessors. Then, tinctures and tonics had promised serenity while delivering dependence, faintness, or the slow erosion of vitality. Now, the injections offered precision, consistency, and scientific reassurance, but the pattern remained: reliance, subtle withdrawal, and the silent expectation that the patient would conform to the city's aesthetic and social ideals. The difference lay not in the nature of the effect, but in the discretion of its administration. Word of the clinics spread quickly, though quietly. Recommendations were whispered, invitations extended subtly, appointments reserved months in advance. Influence and reputation ensured access, while those outside the networks learned of the sanctuaries only through rumor and observation. The clinics were a privilege, an emblem of status as much as a place of bodily care, a modern reflection of the Victorian preoccupation with both refinement and secrecy. And in these private sanctuaries, London learned again the delicate balance between relief and expectation. Comfort was offered in measured doses, wrapped in elegance, reinforced by ritual. Patients emerged calm, slender, composed, yet tethered subtly to the chemical promises of the clinic, dependent upon its routine, its structure, its invisible governance. London had discovered its modern refuge. Clinics of consolation, where discipline, desire, and chemical mastery intertwined. A place where appearances were polished, nerves soothed, and appetite silenced. All beneath the soft, forgiving glow of light that seemed to say, "Here, you may be perfect, if only for a moment." London has never resisted opportunity. It thrives upon it, cultivates it, dresses it in silk and discretion, and presents it with a flourish that suggests inevitability. When the injections first arrived, promising to silence appetite and shape the body with mechanical precision, the city's entrepreneurs responded with an urgency reminiscent of the Victorian era's own fevered pursuit of profit. It was a quiet, elegant gold rush, fueled not by the lust for metal, but by the desire for refinement, status, and chemical control. The streets, once dotted with modest apothecaries and small chemist shops, quickly transformed. Sleek boutiques opened in Mayfair and Chelsea, their brass plaques understated, their interiors designed to impress without revealing too much. Behind glass counters, vials gleamed like gemstones, their contents measured with precision that seemed to confer legitimacy. Advertising was subtle, persuasive, an emphasis on wellness, balance, and modern elegance rather than desire or compulsion. Yet those who knew the city's history read between the lines, understanding that discreet marketing rarely hides the sweep of demand. Pharmaceutical houses sensed the opportunity immediately. Contracts were drawn, laboratories expanded, and production schedules accelerated. Suppliers of raw compounds moved quietly but efficiently, navigating regulatory corridors with the same meticulous care as the city's socialites arranging invitations. Orders multiplied exponentially, both for private clinics and discreet delivery networks, creating a web of commerce that spanned from Westminster to the edges of Hampstead Heath. London had entered a fever of consumption, a gold rush disguised in clinical language and quiet elegance. Entrepreneurs did not stop at mere supply. Accessories, manuals, and supplementary products proliferated, forming an ecosystem reminiscent of Victorian patent medicine mania. Journals instructed users on scheduling and dosage. Travel kits allowed discreet injections on the go. Decorative cases were designed to complement handbags and evening ensembles. Each new innovation promised safety, discretion, and social acceptability. Yet beneath the polished surface lay the age-old calculus of profit. The more dependency cultivated, the more secure the market. Investors observed with quiet satisfaction. Stocks in pharmaceutical companies rose as the city's obsession deepened. Analysts spoke of the injections as a revolution, emphasizing efficiency and scientific credibility while avoiding acknowledgement of societal pressures or physiological cost. In parlors and private clubs, businessmen discussed opportunities with careful smiles, as if commerce itself were an art form polished, invisible, and untouchable. The pattern was eerily familiar. In the Victorian era, patent medicines promised vitality, refinement, or beauty. They were sold with flourish, wrapped in charm and elegance, and consumed with faith. The financial gains were enormous, the consequences often hidden, deferred, or ignored. Now, the injections carried the same potential for profit and prestige, and London, ever willing to admire refinement, responded with enthusiasm. Those who controlled supply controlled social influence, subtle status, and, in some ways, desire itself. Yet, as with all gold rushes, there were risks beneath the shimmer. Counterfeit injections appeared in shadowed corners, sold discreetly at high prices to the unwary. Unregulated clinics offered enhanced doses, preying on those whose fear of imperfection surpassed caution. Behind the gleaming facades and discreet marketing, danger lurked, a silent companion to ambition and profit. London's gold rush was both triumphant and fragile, a city-wide celebration of control, vanity, and commerce that mirrored its Victorian past in almost every respect. The city pursued its prize with elegance and determination, all the while ignoring the faint echoes of history whispering warnings from fog-laden streets and shadowed parlours. The injections were London's modern treasure, gleaming in polished vials. And the city, ever hungry for refinement, claimed them with fervour. Profit, appearance, and obsession flowed together. The triumvirate of a gold rush dressed in silk and secrecy. London, ever impatient yet meticulously composed, had embraced the injections with a fervour that belied its customary restraint. Shelves emptied as quickly as they were stocked, appointment books filled with a precision that bordered on mania, and whispers of the scarcity to come began to drift through the city, soft at first, then insistent, like the gentle warning of distant foghorns before a storm. Scarcity, London learned, was far more dangerous than abundance, for it stirred anxiety in a city built upon control, appearance, and the illusion of effortless mastery. The first signs were subtle. A boutique clinic in Kensington notified its clientele of limited weekly supplies. Patrons, accustomed to punctuality and predictability, felt a stir of unease. The receptionist's words were carefully neutral. "We have only a few appointments remaining." But the tone carried urgency, and urgency in London always spreads faster than gossip. News travelled swiftly, through whispered conversations at private teas, through messages sent discreetly across the digital currents of social media, through furtive glances exchanged in gallery foyers. The city's elite felt the first prickling of concern. The injections were no longer simply a tool, they had become a commodity of competition. Panic, however, did not announce itself with chaos. London's panic is always polite, precise, measured, a reflection of the city's enduring obsession with manners and refinement. Yet beneath the calm, a storm brewed. Families in Belgravia adjusted their schedules, sending servants to collect supplies at odd hours. Women in Chelsea whispered of securing appointments months in advance, of placing parcels with trusted couriers. Men discussed access quietly in clubs, their voices lowered, their concern for propriety masking the undercurrent of fear. The scarcity had transformed desire into obsession, necessity into compulsion. The parallels to Victorian scarcity were unmistakable. In the late 19th century, certain tonics and tinctures were coveted, arriving only sporadically in apothecary windows, prompting women to queue for hours or trade favors to obtain a few drops of chemical promise. The consequences of missed opportunity were never dramatic in appearance but profoundly felt. Anxiety, envy, and the faint desperation that comes with losing control of one's body, or at least the perception of control. Now, the modern injections, encased in clinical polish and scientific language, elicited the same shadowed response. The city adjusted. Pharmacies instituted waiting lists. Schedules became strategic, and those with influence secured priority. Online forums, ostensibly meant for education, became hubs of whispered trading, subtle barter, and clandestine recommendation. In drawing rooms, subtle glances and coded questions replaced open discussion. Londoners understood that scarcity was a social signal. Those who managed it best would be rewarded, while the unprepared would risk falling behind in the delicate hierarchy of refinement. Yet the storm had consequences beyond the social sphere. Anxiety, once a quiet companion, now took residence in the body, manifesting as tremors, nausea, and restless energy in those awaiting their appointments. The very calm promised by the injections became unstable, undermined by the gnawing knowledge that supply was finite, access uncertain, and perfection fleeting. London had long known the price of desire. It is rarely found in simplicity, often enforced by circumstance, and always measured by the subtle tension between what is wanted and what is attainable. Scarcity, once merely a concept, had become a palpable force, shaping behavior, tempering patience, and sharpening the obsession for perfection. The city held its breath, poised between calm and chaos, as the storm of scarcity tightened its invisible grip. And in the hush, beneath lamplight and fog, London realized, desire, when constrained, becomes far more potent than indulgence. Control, London had always believed, was its most elegant adornment. In Victorian parlours, it was expressed in the meticulous lacing of corsets, in the polite restraint of conversation, in the careful regulation of appetite and poise. Every gesture, every glance, every measured sigh was a testament to the city's mastery over the body and the self. Yet, as the modern injections swept through the capital, a subtle unravelling began, imperceptible at first, then undeniable, the collapse of control. It began in small, almost imperceptible ways. A woman in a Mayfair townhouse, accustomed to administering her weekly injection with precision, found her hand trembling slightly as she prepared the dose. The liquid, intended to quiet appetite, now seemed to carry its own subtle instability, a reminder that the body was not fully obedient. She paused, the syringe poised mid-air, and felt a disquiet she had not anticipated. The meticulous control she had cultivated so carefully seemed to waver, however briefly. In offices, the effect manifested differently. Colleagues who had once approached their schedules with near-military exactitude now grew restless, distracted by hunger, suppressed but not entirely absent. The injections provided a facade of composure, yet beneath it, energy fluctuated unpredictably. Moods shifted with subtle caprice, and patience, once a sturdy virtue, grew brittle. Meetings that had flowed with Victorian precision now edged toward tension, participants balancing the expectation of perfection against the quiet rebellion of their bodies. Even in domestic spheres, control faltered. Kitchens that had once conducted the choreography of meals with serene efficiency now echoed with a subtle anxiety. Plates set with care were forgotten as hands shook, as small tremors passed unnoticed but deeply felt. Children, observing, learned quickly. The pursuit of refinement carried a hidden volatility, and even the most disciplined adult could falter. Dinner conversations, intended to instruct manners and etiquette, occasionally descended into whispered warnings or hurried adjustments, as though every participant feared being found wanting by invisible eyes. The parallels to Victorian London were unmistakable. Then, women fainted gracefully behind lace curtains. Now, modern users of injections experienced subtler collapses, less dramatic but equally revealing. The body, long disciplined by social expectation and chemical aid, resisted complete mastery. The city had achieved its ideal of refinement, but only precariously, balanced upon an invisible edge. Publicly, appearances remained intact. Influencers continued to post flawless images, socialites glided through events with apparent ease, and clinicians delivered reassurances with polished confidence. Yet privately, whispers of instability circulated. A friend confided that her hand shook while pouring tea. Another admitted that fatigue lingered longer than anticipated after a supposedly controlled dose. Even those most committed to appearances acknowledged, in quiet tones, that control had limits and perfection was always provisional. And London, in its characteristic elegance, accommodated the collapse without acknowledging it. The city embraced the veneer of mastery while tolerating, or perhaps ignoring, the tremors beneath. Control was not lost entirely. It had merely become fragile, tempered by chemistry but never absolute. The collapse was subtle, insidious, and polite, a reflection of the city itself. It reminded London that every aspiration for perfection carries the risk of fracture, that mastery over the body is always conditional, and that appearances, no matter how refined, can never wholly conceal human vulnerability. In this fragile equilibrium, the city learned an enduring truth. Refinement, elegance, and control are treasures easily admired and perilously difficult to sustain. London had achieved control, and London, quietly, trembled beneath its own achievement. London, for all its elegance and poise, has always been a city defined as much by appearances as by substance. In the Victorian era, social order was maintained through rituals of refinement. Tea poured with delicate precision, conversation guided by carefully measured gestures, appetite restrained beneath layers of lace and expectation. Yet beneath the civility, tension always simmered. Now, in the age of injections and chemical suppression, that tension began to ripple outward, revealing a social fabric stretched thin, fraying quietly, yet relentlessly. The unraveling began in the parlors of Mayfair and Belgravia, where women who had long perfected their composure now found themselves burdened by subtle instability. A hostess would note that a guest, usually poised and serene, tapped her fingers against the table or glanced nervously at the clock. Conversation, once measured and predictable, faltered. Gentle laughter carried an edge of impatience. Even the most experienced socialites sensed the change, a quiet tension lurking beneath the veneer of refinement. Dining rooms, once centers of conviviality and demonstration of etiquette, became stages of careful negotiation. Plates, elegantly arranged, remained largely untouched, as if the body's own voice had been suppressed into near silence. Guests observed one another with heightened attention, eyes flicking to gestures, posture, the faintest tremor in hand or lip. Conversations, once effortless, now required constant modulation. A misstep, a sigh too loud, an unmeasured pause could betray the invisible struggle each person carried. In private homes, families felt the effects keenly. Mothers fretted over appearances, watching their own and their children's compliance with chemical restraint. Fathers, accustomed to measured routines and expectations of propriety, noted the quiet unrest of their colleagues and neighbors and adapted their behavior accordingly. Even children, observing adults, learned the same unspoken rules. Desire must be suppressed, composure maintained, appearances preserved. The city's obsession with refinement had infiltrated the very marrow of domestic life, altering daily interactions with subtle, pervasive authority. The effect extended to professional spaces as well. Offices, lecture halls, and salons all became arenas where the illusion of calm masked the strain of chemical dependence. Colleagues observed, compared, and emulated each other's composure, perpetuating a culture of silent performance. Efficiency, once an outcome of skill, now became inseparable from the maintenance of bodily suppression. Those who faltered even briefly were noted, quietly judged, and often corrected with polite suggestion or the delicate pressure of social expectation. The parallels to Victorian society were unmistakable. Then, ladies fainted elegantly behind curtains. Now, subtle tremors and fatigue hinted at the body's rebellion. Then, gentlemen masked irritation beneath cultivated politeness. Now, micro-expressions and fleeting impatience revealed the tension beneath enforced composure. London's obsession with control, though chemically assisted, continued to exact its quiet toll. And yet, the city persisted. Streets and cafes glowed with the illusion of serenity. Drawing rooms shimmered under lamplight as polite conversation flowed. Social media displayed curated perfection, photographs capturing flawless form and unruffled demeanor. Beneath it all, however, the social fabric quivered, stretched taut over invisible fault lines. London's social order remained intact, superficially beautiful, and seemingly unshakable. But in the careful movements, the whispered hesitations, the hidden anxieties, the city felt the first tremors of unraveling. The performance of elegance continued, yes, but it was fragile, precarious, and increasingly reliant upon the chemical hand that had promised mastery and discretion. In this quiet disarray, London discovered a truth long familiar yet ever poignant. Appearances may endure, rituals may continue, but social equilibrium, like the body itself, remains vulnerable beneath the weight of obsession. In London, the body has always been a canvas upon which society paints its ideals, a vessel through which status, refinement, and discipline are measured. In the Victorian era, the battleground was visible. Corsets laced until ribs ached, teeth whitened with powders, skin blanched with precaution. Every gesture, posture, and sigh was part of the contest to assert control over flesh and perception. Now, in the modern age of injections, the body remained a battleground, though the methods had shifted from fabric and powder to the quiet precision of chemistry. The injection, administered with clinical ritual, promised serenity and the appearance of effortless mastery. Hunger, once a persistent companion, was subdued with a measured dose. Limbs moved with grace, torsos retained ideal proportions, postures became deliberately poised. On the surface, the victory appeared complete. Yet beneath the skin, subtle skirmishes persisted, microcosmic conflicts between the body's demands and the mind's expectations. Women, accustomed to refinement, found themselves negotiating with their own bodies as carefully as they did with society. A slight tremor in the hand, a flutter of nausea, or a moment of light-headedness became invisible indicators of the ongoing struggle. Every meal avoided, every calorie resisted, every injection punctuated a silent duel, a negotiation in which the body conceded outward appearance at the expense of inner equilibrium. These minor victories, celebrated quietly in drawing rooms and salons, carried a hidden cost: fatigue, irritability, and the slow accumulation of stress within cells too disciplined to betray themselves openly. Men, too, experienced the invisible contest. Businessmen, maintaining composure during long hours, relied on injections to quiet appetite and sustain focus. Yet subtle indicators, sleeves clutched too tightly, pale hands brushing nervously against desks, micro shifts in posture revealed the internal struggle. The battleground was not visible to the public eye, but it was intensely felt by those inhabiting it. An intimate war waged quietly beneath the layers of clothing, under the soft gaze of polite society. The parallels to Victorian London were inescapable. Then, women endured fainting spells and dizzying rigidity to achieve elegance. Now, chemical suppression allowed similar mastery with subtler consequences. The body's rebellion, though muted, persisted as a reminder that control, however technologically mediated, is always provisional, always negotiated. Every injection, every measured abstention, reinforced the social hierarchy, creating an invisible map of compliance and endurance. Private households became training grounds for the battles waged within the body. Children observed, absorbing the rules of restraint without words. The quiet control of appetite, the careful management of gestures, the meticulous cultivation of composure. Kitchens and dining rooms became arenas where victory was measured in untouched plates and steady hands rather than consumption or laughter. The lessons were implicit but unmistakable. Mastery of the self, enforced chemically, was the highest form of refinement. The city itself seemed to understand the stakes. Streets hummed with quiet diligence. Cafes hosted patrons who moved delicately, sipping tea while their minds calculated and measured, always aware of appearances. Influencers posted images calibrated to convey control, their bodies framed with precision, their expressions serene, masking the internal struggle that each follower might only guess at. The battleground extended into digital spaces, where every scroll, every double tap, reinforced the hierarchy of mastery. London had long elevated appearance over essence, control over indulgence. The injections promised to perfect that tradition, granting superficial victory while the internal conflict continued. In the modern battleground, victory was measured not in comfort or satisfaction, but in the quiet maintenance of form, the suppression of want, the endurance of social expectation. The body remained a contested space, a site where elegance and discipline collided with physiology and desire. London celebrated the surface triumph, unaware or unwilling to admit that the war continued beneath, silent, relentless, and profoundly human. In London, no ritual of refinement is complete without the presence of those who wield authority behind the scenes. In the Victorian age, physicians, apothecaries, and surgeons occupied a delicate position, arbiters of health, arbiters of decorum, keepers of secrets hidden beneath white coats and polished manners. Now, in the modern era of injections, doctors continued this legacy, standing under the soft glow of lamplight, their hands steady, their faces composed, and their voices calibrated to reassure while concealing the subtle unease of their profession. Consultation rooms, quiet and orderly, were filled with the faint hum of reassurance. Your dosage is appropriate. We have monitored your response. Continue as prescribed. Each phrase, delivered in a tone of calm authority, mirrored the Victorian doctor's soft-spoken admonitions. The measured cadences meant to instill confidence while masking the uncertainty inherent in human physiology. The lamps cast long, gentle shadows across polished tables, illuminating stacks of charts, digital screens, and meticulously labeled vials, modern instruments, in a timeless performance. Doctors observed with vigilance, yet delicacy. A slight tremor of the hand, a subtle pallor across the cheek, a momentary hesitation in movement, all were noted, catalogued, and measured. Nothing escaped the quiet scrutiny of professional attention. Patients, believing themselves sovereign over their own bodies, were often unaware that even in the act of concealment, the faint smile, the composed posture, they were observed, assessed, and silently guided toward conformity. The parallels to Victorian practice were uncanny. Then, physicians adjusted tonics, gauged the faintest reactions to ether, and recorded the subtle effects of opiate tinctures. Now, modern practitioners monitored injection schedules, logged metabolic responses, and interpreted patient-reported sensations with clinical precision. The methods had changed, but the underlying principle remained. The city's well-being and appearance was a delicate negotiation, mediated by men and women of science who understood both the power and the fragility of control. Beyond the technical vigilance lay the moral and social dimension. Physicians navigated a labyrinth of expectations. Patients demanded results, families expected visible refinement, and society silently assessed compliance and discipline. The injections were marketed as tools of wellness, yet their administration carried the weight of judgment. Those who faltered risked not only diminished results, but subtle censure. The doctor, standing under the lamplight, became both guide and guardian, balancing authority with discretion, reassurance with vigilance. Even the environment reinforced the ritual. The warm, amber glow of lamps softened the clinical austerity, echoing Victorian gaslight and casting shadows that hinted at secrets kept. The faint scent of antiseptic mingled with polished wood and soft upholstery, creating an atmosphere that simultaneously comforted and cautioned. Each consultation was a delicate performance. The physician calm, the patient composed, and the unspoken acknowledgement that mastery over the body was always a conditional, precarious achievement. As the evening deepened, the doctors concluded their consultations and documented the day's observations, recording subtle shifts in patient behavior, physiological responses, and adherence. The city outside moved with its usual quiet haste, unaware of the subtle orchestration occurring beneath lamplight and shadow. London, as always, trusted its physicians. It accepted guidance, reassurance, and prescription with the same faith its Victorian ancestors had placed in tonics, tinctures, and ether. And under the lamplight, doctors observed, measured, and preserved the delicate balance between desire, discipline, and the chemical mastery that defined the city's newest pursuit of refinement. Even in the privacy of their homes, Londoners found that the city's obsession with injections reached silently into the very marrow of family life. What began as an individual pursuit of refinement, a quiet attempt to master appetite and maintain an idealized silhouette, soon wove itself into domestic routines, shaping the rhythms, anxieties, and expectations of every household. Families, once united by shared meals and mutual indulgences, now found themselves caught in a spiral, one both invisible and inexorably binding. In Victorian households, mothers had long been the guardians of propriety, orchestrating meals with meticulous care, instructing daughters in the delicate art of restraint, and preserving appearances while smoothing the edges of imperfection. Fathers monitored behavior and decorum, reinforcing discipline through quiet observation and subtle reprimand. Children learned quickly that manners and appearances were matters of survival, as much as of social expectation. Now, in the modern era, these roles were transformed but hauntingly familiar. The injections had replaced corsets and tonics, yet the lessons remained the same. Appetite must be regulated, composure must be maintained, perfection must be displayed. The spiral revealed itself in small, nearly imperceptible ways. Mothers observed themselves in mirrors while preparing breakfast, noting the subtle shift in their own hunger, the tremor in a hand accustomed to measured doses. They guided children in the new etiquette of restraint: nibble sparingly, sip deliberately, maintain composure even when hunger tugs insistently at the body. Fathers, too, became participants in the pattern, carefully calibrating their own consumption and modeling control for the eyes of their children. The family table, once a place of nourishment and warmth, had become a theater in which the invisible choreography of chemical mastery played out. The children, sensitive and observant, absorbed the rhythm of this disciplined environment. Lunchtime, formerly a predictable and comforting ritual, transformed into a subtle rehearsal in restraint. The absence of appetite in parents became a lesson. Desire must be tempered, indulgence must be discreet, and deviation from expectation must be concealed. The spiral extended further as children, seeking social approval in schools and neighborhoods, mimicked these patterns, internalizing the lesson that perfection, chemical, social, and aesthetic was an imperative. Even domestic conversations were affected. Topics shifted to schedules, doses, and subtle observations of changes in posture or mood. The quiet anxiety of compliance, previously confined to drawing rooms and offices, now threaded itself through daily interaction, coloring politeness with tension. Compliments were measured, observations hedged with cautious phrasing, and the faintest display of indulgence or appetite became a topic of whispered concern. In the home, as in the city at large, the boundaries between health, aesthetics, and propriety blurred. The echoes of Victorian discipline were unmistakable. Just as mothers once ensured that daughters navigated the subtle expectations of society with poise, so too did modern households cultivate composure with chemical assistance. Yet the spiral was deeper now, reinforced by injections and social comparison, embedding itself invisibly into the very structure of domestic life. London families, though composed outwardly, felt the weight of this spiral in the quiet moments. A mother checking her reflection while preparing tea, a father pausing before lunch to measure restraint, a child learning to suppress desire before even understanding its purpose. The city's obsession, once the concern of salons and clinics, had seeped into the hearth, reshaping intimacy, instruction, and expectation. With the subtle precision of fog curling through narrow streets, the spiral was relentless, yet invisible. And within every household, in whispered moments and careful gestures, Londoners discovered that refinement demanded not just appearance, but obedience to the body, to society, and to the chemical promise that bound them all. Every era, no matter how refined or disciplined, eventually confronts its own consequences. In Victorian London, faint praise, and secret consumption of tonics and tinctures carried subtle costs, fragile health, whispered scandals, and invisible dependencies. Now, in the modern age, as injections had swept through drawing rooms, clinics, and private households, the city found itself facing a chemical reckoning, the invisible price of composure and refinement, paid in tremors, fatigue, and the quiet surrender of appetite. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed. A secretary in Mayfair felt an unusual flutter in her chest during a meeting, attributing it to fatigue rather than chemical influence. A young mother in Chelsea experienced a wave of dizziness while arranging afternoon tea, masking her disorientation behind a practiced smile. These incidents, individually minor, coalesced into a pattern, the body speaking softly, insistently, through signs that the mind and society were unwilling to acknowledge. Clinics, once temples of reassurance, now became spaces of cautious observation. Doctors recorded subtle anomalies, fluctuating energy, unexpected lightheadedness, and minor disruptions to metabolic balance. Their notes, precise and meticulous, were filled with clinical language, carefully avoiding alarm. Yet beneath the neutral phrasing lay concern, a recognition that the chemical instruments of control, while elegant and effective, carried consequences invisible to polite observation. In the private sphere, the reckoning manifested through whispers and shared anxieties. Families noted fatigue, irritability, and a quiet restlessness in household members, attributing these symptoms to stress, work, or emotional strain. Children, ever observant, sensed the tension. The spiral of chemical mastery meant to refine and perfect now introduced unease, threading through domestic life like fog through narrow streets, subtle yet persistent. Even in social circles, the signs were palpable. Guests at dinner parties and soirees moved with the usual poise, yet the faintest tremors betrayed the presence of internal struggle. Eyes flickered briefly toward untouched plates. Hands hovered uncertainly over cutlery. Laughter, though composed, carried a slight tension. Politeness masked the toll, but it did not erase it. London, ever enamored with appearances, maintained the veneer of control. even as the body quietly resisted. The media, initially enraptured by the promise of refinement, began to publish tentative reports, minor side effects, subtle disturbances, and expert warnings couched in cautious language. Headlines emphasized wellness, balance, and moderation, but attentive readers discerned the shadow beneath the polish, a city negotiating with its own chemistry, unsure how to balance desire and discipline, pleasure and appearance. The chemical reckoning was neither dramatic nor loud. It arrived gently, persistently, like a tide rising beneath cobblestones, imperceptible until it had shaped the streets. Londoners, in their dedication to elegance and control, often ignored these signs, confident that their refinement and composure would shield them from consequence. Yet history whispered from the fog, every era that embraces perfection without heed of cost eventually pays a subtle but inevitable toll. By evening, when gas lamps cast long shadows across narrow streets and lamplit windows reflected composed faces, the city paused only briefly to consider its state. It had mastered appearance, curated appetite, and achieved a chemical elegance, but beneath the surface, subtle tremors, fatigue, and anxiety murmured of the cost. London had attained refinement, yet the reckoning, quiet and relentless, waited patiently in the shadows. Perfection, like all things in London, comes with a price. And the chemical reckoning, long delayed and softly whispered, had begun to claim its due. There comes a moment in every cycle of indulgence, obsession, and refinement when a city, even as grand and measured as London, must pause and reckon with the precipice upon which it teeters. In the age of injections, when appetite was silenced and composure polished to an almost mechanical sheen, that moment arrived with quiet, almost imperceptible hesitation. London, for the first time in months, seemed to inhale slowly, aware that the pursuit of perfection carries consequences too subtle to be measured by appearance alone. The streets, usually alive with the muted bustle of evening commerce and measured footsteps, seemed to adopt a different rhythm. Footfalls softened against the cobblestones, conversations slowed, restrained by a collective awareness of fragility. Even the fog, that ever-present witness to the city's triumphs and follies, lingered in denser folds, as if urging caution, urging reflection. For beneath the elegance, beneath the social grace, and beneath the carefully maintained silhouettes, a tension had begun to accumulate, a tension that demanded recognition. Private homes mirrored this subtle shift. Families, previously caught in the spiral of chemical mastery, found moments to pause and observe. Mothers noted the fatigue that even the injections could not fully suppress. Fathers recognized that the children, once untroubled by appetite, now reflected the same quiet tension in their gestures, the same meticulous self-discipline that had been silently enforced by example. The dining table, which had served as stage and theater, became for a moment a place of reflection, as those gathered recognized the precariousness of their routine. Clinics, too, experienced the shift. Physicians noted that patients arrived with a new sense of hesitancy. Questions became more detailed, concerns more nuanced. The calm authority that doctors had long exercised under lamplight now met with guarded inquiry, subtle skepticism, and an implicit awareness of the body's persistent demands. The chemical promise, though elegant, was no longer accepted blindly. Patients questioned, measured, and reflected, as if the city collectively sensed that mastery over the body might never be absolute. The parallels to Victorian caution were unmistakable. Then, after decades of tonics, tinctures, and ether, society had occasionally recoiled from the consequences of excess, fainting, dependency, and subtle moral critique. Now, in the age of injections, London displayed the same instinct, though dressed in modern sophistication. Reflection replaced fervor, hesitation tempered enthusiasm, and the hum of ambition was muted by the quiet knowledge that perfection, however alluring, could not be pursued without cost. Even in social gatherings, the effect was noticeable. Conversation paused, just slightly, to consider well-being alongside appearance. Compliments were tempered with awareness. Gestures, once fluid and unconstrained, carried an undercurrent of measurement. The city, in its collective comportment, stepped back, if only subtly, from the edge of obsession. The fog, the lamplight, the gleaming streets, all conspired to remind citizens that elegance is not merely the absence of disorder, but the presence of careful balance. London had learned a lesson both old and new, that the pursuit of refinement, while intoxicating, is fragile. That composure, achieved through chemical aid, is powerful, yet vulnerable. That the city's collective ambition, however disciplined, exists in delicate equilibrium with the human body and mind it seeks to control. And so, for a brief and rare moment, London exhaled. It acknowledged the edge. It recognized the precipice. And, ever so carefully, it stepped back. London carries its history like a mantle, heavy with the weight of centuries, embroidered with triumphs, follies, and the quiet tragedies of those who lived and perished within its fog-laden streets. In the age of injections, as the city pursued refinement and chemical mastery with the same fervor that had once driven Victorian women to faint in parlours or sip tinctures under the guise of health, the weight of that history pressed insistently against the present. Shadows of past excesses and silent dependencies lingered, reminding the city that every pursuit of perfection carries consequences beyond appearance. The parallels were unmistakable. Victorian London had celebrated elegance at the expense of the body. Corsets constricted until lungs protested. Laudanum dulled nerves and appetite alike. Ether delivered momentary relief while cultivating quiet reliance. Entire households structured their lives around appearances, suppressing natural needs to maintain the facade of control. Now, in the modern age, the injections offered similar mastery with scientific veneer, precise measurements, and carefully curated messaging. Yet beneath the sleek surfaces, the echoes of past eras whispered, refinement, no matter how disciplined, exacts its toll. Families, attuned to social expectation, felt this weight keenly. Dinner tables, once arenas of negotiation between hunger and etiquette, had been transformed into stages of chemical obedience. Children observed, internalized, and mirrored these patterns, learning that appetite was a liability and restraint a virtue. Mothers monitored doses, fathers observed posture and energy, and the city's social machinery ensured that subtle perfection remained visible at all times. In these private spaces, the lessons of Victorian restraint had not been forgotten. They had merely adapted, moving quietly through syringes and schedules rather than tonics and corsets. Public spaces reflected the same inheritance. Cafes and galleries, streets and trains were populated by individuals whose bodies and gestures had been subtly sculpted by chemical discipline. Social media amplified the effect, curating images of elegance, slenderness, and composure that hearkened to Victorian ideals of presentation. Followers, both real and imagined, assessed each pose, each smile, each posture with the meticulous scrutiny that 19th century society had applied to waistlines and comportment. London, in its collective gaze, had resurrected the standards of an earlier era with modern instruments. Even clinicians felt the pull of history. Physicians observed not only the physiological responses of their patients, but also the social implications of chemical mastery. They were acutely aware that a failure to manage both could unravel the delicate equilibrium, echoing the lessons learned from the fainting spells, dependency, and societal pressures of Victorian times. The clinics themselves, polished and precise, became repositories of both modern science and the inherited anxieties of a city that had always prized appearance over comfort. The weight of history pressed also upon those who resisted, subtly influencing behavior through expectation alone. skeptics and new entrants to society's elite circles found themselves adjusting posture, moderating appetite, and mimicking restraint, often unconsciously. The legacy of centuries had been inscribed not in ink but in habits, anticipation, and the quiet pressure to conform. And so, London moved beneath the soft lamplight and fog with a dual consciousness, present and past intertwined. The city's obsession with refinement, amplified by chemical intervention, was simultaneously an homage to and a cautionary echo of the Victorians who had first demonstrated the seductive power of control. Elegance remained paramount, but the memory of what unbridled pursuit of perfection could exact lingered, a gentle, persistent pressure upon every gesture and glance. London carried the weight of history, and beneath the glow of gaslight and electric lamps, in the hush of its streets and the quiet of its parlours, it walked that weight with careful, almost reverent steps, aware, at last, that the past had not yet finished teaching its lessons. Even the most disciplined city eventually feels the stirrings of what it has sought to suppress. In Victorian London, appetite had been restrained, muted, often denied, while society praised elegance and composure over nourishment. Now, in the age of injections, as the chemical mastery over hunger reached its apex, the first subtle tremors of appetite began to reassert themselves, like a distant tide creeping back beneath polished floors and velvet-draped drawing rooms. London, which had grown accustomed to quiet control, felt the whisper of desire return with disarming persistence. It began in small, almost imperceptible ways. A mother in Kensington, long reliant on her weekly dose, noticed a subtle gnawing in her stomach one morning, while preparing breakfast for her children. She paused, spoon in hand, and felt the unfamiliar recognition of need. It was not overwhelming, not yet, but enough to unsettle her carefully calibrated routine. Across the city, similar sensations rippled quietly. A secretary's hands lingered a moment too long over the pastry tray. A student in Chelsea found herself eyeing a cafe display with sudden longing. A young socialite felt the faint pang of craving during a gallery reception. These stirrings were attended with both fascination and anxiety. The chemical control that had seemed absolute now revealed its limitations. Subtle aches, pangs, and fleeting hunger became reminders that the body, however disciplined or chemically assisted, could not be silenced indefinitely. Victorian lessons resurfaced. The body is patient, persistent, insistent. It remembers what has been denied and waits for its moment to assert itself. Within households, the slow return of appetite prompted a quiet recalibration. Children, previously trained to emulate restraint, noticed the small deviations in their parents' comportment. Mothers and fathers adjusted, sometimes consciously, sometimes reflexively, to accommodate the subtle signals of hunger, while still maintaining the appearances demanded by society. The table, long a stage for demonstration of elegance, regained a faint warmth as morsels were tentatively tasted, sipped, or nibbled, restoring a rhythm that had been suspended for months. In social circles, the effect was more delicate, yet equally potent. Guests at afternoon teas or evening gatherings noted the faint changes. A hand brushing toward a plate, eyes lingering on food longer than expected, a brief hesitation in posture that betrayed suppressed need. These small signs circulated like whispered rumors, subtle acknowledgments that chemical mastery, though powerful, could not fully erase the body's demands. The city, ever attentive to appearances, adapted with discretion, allowing the slow reintroduction of appetite while preserving the elegance that defined its social rituals. The parallels to Victorian caution were unmistakable. In the 19th century, fainting and measured indulgence had reminded society that bodies resist total control. Now, in the 21st century, injections offered refinement at the cost of temporary suppression. Yet the return of desire served as a gentle, persistent lesson. Mastery is provisional, and balance must eventually be restored. The city, which had exhaled beneath lamplight and fog when chemical control seemed complete, now acknowledged the subtle, insistent truth that appetite is neither shameful nor indulgent, it is vital, a measure of life itself. And so, across London, the slow return of appetite unfolded quietly, a creeping reminder beneath polished surfaces and refined gestures. Plates were tasted, spoons moved, and the body reclaimed its voice, soft yet unmistakable. The city, attuned to elegance but wise in memory, embraced this subtle reclamation with the discretion and composure that had always defined it. London had learned once again, hunger, like history, cannot be fully denied. It returns softly, insistently, and with the quiet authority of the body itself. London has always possessed a peculiar memory, one that is both long and selective. Streets, buildings, and fog-laden alleys retain echoes of triumph and folly alike, yet the city's inhabitants are quick to ignore the whispers of the past when ambition, vanity, or desire presses upon them. Now, at the close of the age of injections, as appetite quietly returned and the chemical mastery that had once seemed absolute revealed its limits, London faced a final, enduring lesson, a lesson the city has known before and, inevitably, will forget again. The lesson is simple yet profound. Perfection, whether imposed by corset, tonic, ether, or injection, carries its own cost. Elegance is seductive, control intoxicating, and refinement a prize easily admired. Yet all these come at the price of vigilance, self-awareness, and a willingness to acknowledge human limits. Victorian London learned this in fainting parlours, behind lace curtains, and in the careful administration of tonics that promised beauty and composure. Modern London learned it again, with needles and vials, clinics and influencers, chemical mastery that silenced appetite and sculpted the body with precision. And in both eras, the cost, while often invisible, was undeniable. Families across the city, households long accustomed to the disciplined rhythm of chemical regulation, felt the lesson in the quiet tremors of returning appetite. Mothers and fathers adjusted their expectations, noticing the subtle stirrings of hunger in themselves and their children, aware that control was provisional. Children, who had learned to imitate restraint with mechanical precision, now observed the limits of that mastery, internalizing the same cautionary tale once whispered through Victorian drawing rooms. The body, like history itself, resists absolute command. Social circles, too, were reminded. Parlour conversations, gallery visits, and soirees, once dominated by polished composure, now carried hints of tension and subtle anxiety. Guests noticed tremors, hesitations, and the faint but unmistakable signs that even chemical discipline could not enforce perfection indefinitely. The city, always attentive to appearances, adapted gracefully, yet beneath the calm shimmer of manners, the truth was clear. Mastery of form cannot equate to mastery of life, and appearances are never absolute. Clinics and physicians, standing under lamplight, recorded the quiet consequences, noting fluctuations in mood, energy, and appetite. They recognized, as Victorian doctors did, that refinement is always provisional, a delicate balance between desire, discipline, and the inevitable persistence of the body. The lesson of caution, of careful moderation, is as old as the streets themselves, and yet, as always, it risks being forgotten in favor of ambition, vanity, or the seductive promise of effortless control. The fog that curls around the city at dusk seems to whisper the truth. It drifts through alleys, along cobblestones, and past lamplight, carrying with it memories of fainting women, clandestine tonics, and the quiet determination of generations. It reminds London that desire cannot be erased, that control is never total, and that every pursuit of perfection, however polished or scientific, carries consequences that must be acknowledged. And so the lesson remains, soft yet insistent, whispered beneath the lamplight, woven into the streets and buildings, and recorded in the quiet tremors of returning appetite. Elegance and mastery are transient. The pursuit of perfection is alluring, but the cost is perpetual vigilance. London will forget again, as it always does. It will embrace its next obsession, marvel at its next marvel, and once more learn, eventually, that every era repeats its story, and every citizen is reminded, quietly, by the city itself. The lesson endures, even if the city, as ever, cannot.